Tyranny of Steel. Author Zentmeister. Chapters 29 to 41. Chapter 29. The Age of Knights has already passed. Under the cover of night, the army in which Berengar had formed rapidly covered the distance between Kufstein and Wildschonau. By the time the dawn had arrived, they had occupied Mining Town and detained Ulrich's workers. The sappers in the field began to construct fortifications surrounding the mining towns. By the end of the day, the makeshift town would resemble a miniature version of fortifications used during the siege of Petersburg from Berengar's previous life. The volunteer militia manned the fortifications while others interrogated the workers that had been detained. Eckhard personally oversaw this effort. He began by speaking to the workforce Berengar had brought with him, which was far more loyal to the people of Kufstein where they had grown up. However, they were unaware of the assassination plot, but when they heard that Berengar might be stuck in the mines, they quickly revealed the only information they knew, which was that the foreman had led Berengar into the mines during a routine excavation and that they were oddly ordered to withdraw. Nobody saw Berengar again after that, but a large explosion was heard, which they had assumed was regular construction. When Berengar's workers had asked the foreman about their lord's whereabouts, the man claimed that Berengar had left to visit Lord Ulrich. After hearing such information, Eckhard immediately seized the foreman who had already been detained and violently tortured the man for the information regarding the exact location where Berengar had been trapped. After some good old medieval justice, the man sang like a canary, and the rescue operations had begun. Meanwhile, Berengar was trapped inside the confines of the collapsed shaft. He had no food or water and was slightly injured. It was a miracle that no serious injury had occurred. He was slightly concussed and possibly had a broken rib. Luckily it had not punctured his lung, or else he would long since have passed from this world. His throat was dry, as he had not quenched his thirst since before the cave-in, and while stuck in the darkness with no way out, he began to become deeply paranoid about the forces conspiring against him. He swore that if he survived this ordeal, he would personally lay siege to Ulrich's castle and drag him to the dungeons by the throat. There was simply no possibility the Lord of Wildschonau was not involved in this attempt on Berengar's life. Shortly after having such thoughts, he had heard a muffled voice behind the rubble, which he could barely recognize as belonging to Ludwig. "My lord, can you hear me? Are you alive in there?" With a hoarse voice caused by dehydration and breathing in the fumes of the debris, Berengar managed to converse with the man behind the wall. "Ludwig, is that you? How the hell did you find me?" Ludwig had an enormous smile spread across his face when he heard that the young lord was still alive. He began to speak awkwardly as he confessed to how he found out about his current predicament. It's me. Though I'm not one capable of judging the actions of the nobility such as yourself, your brother's fiancée Erm revealed your current situation to me as she begged me to save your life." Berengar could not help but chuckle but groaned in pain as he did so. He had definitely fractured a rib, and it made breathing difficult and laughing agonizing. "Dear lord, do I love that woman? She came through for me once again. I'm seriously going to need to reward her this time." Ludwig could tell by the tone of Berengar's voice what the young lord was implying and could not help but sigh. It is good to be young. After getting out those words, he decided to inform Berengar of what was transpiring. "Just hang on. I've got hundreds of the villagers to come to your rescue. You should be out of there in no time." Berengar quickly realized the problem with this. There was not the slightest possibility that their actions would go unnoticed by Ulrich. After all, this was his land that they were currently standing upon. When the Lord found out that there was an ongoing attempt to rescue the target of his assassination, he would undoubtedly send his army in an attempt to cover his tracks. As such, he began to give orders to Ludwig. "Ludwig, my friend, you need to get Eckhard to muster the militia. When the Lord of Wildschonau finds out what you are doing, he will surely send his army to eliminate you all." Ludwig could not help but chuckle. He knew what Berengar was thinking and had already acted accordingly. "Please rest assured, my lord, Sir Eckhard and his men are already here fortifying the position as we speak. All 600 men and 6 guns are currently in a position to defend this mine with their lives." 600 men and 6 guns? Fucking Christ, I need to give these guys a raise. They're working way too hard. Berengar thought to himself as he laid down and waited for rescue. For now, he had no choice but to wait for the excavation to be complete. If Ulrich showed up with his meager army during this time, he would be in for a rude awakening. The might of his militia was not to be underestimated, though the feudal forces of this world were sure to do so. A soldier in the field was in the process of cleaning his musket. This musket was personally designed by Berengar and was named the 1417 land pattern musket, and it was quite an anachronistic design. It utilized a 46-inch barrel much like the infamous Brown Bess, used by the British Army for a length of time, and a similar flintlock design. Yet, the stock was closer in design used by the early doglock muskets utilized by English forces during the English Civil War. As such, the firearm maintained quite the Renaissance aesthetic. The primary difference in the design of the stock was that it had been cut off shorter at the end of the barrel to allow for the attachment of a socket bayonet. The stock also had sling swivels, and each musket was equipped with a leather sling. The 46-inch barrel was bored in a .58 caliber and had iron sights similar to the 1861 Springfield rifled muskets used by Union forces during the American Civil War. The reason for these two things was that they were all manufactured with the intent to be rebored and rifled for the use of the .58 caliber mini-ball projectile when the factory could handle such an extensive workload. It was truly a unique design blending components of three eras of musket development from Berengar's past life. This was a weapon designed with two purposes in mind: waging war in the most efficient manner available and looking good while doing it. The soldiers who wielded this mighty weapon were using their downtime to clean their muskets and ensure everything was functioning properly. It would not be long before Ulrich and his armies arrived. Though they had quite the defensive position, as well as a numerical advantage, most of these men had never seen a battlefield before. Those who had been in the field were now officers and NCO respectively and formed the veteran backbone necessary to lead their men properly. Against a professional and experienced force, things might not go so smoothly. As the sun began to set, the soldier cleaning his musket pointed into the distance as he saw a scout on horseback riding off towards the castle. A scout? Where's the marksman? Take him out now. Berengar had implemented tactics from modern doctrine and installed a designated marksman with a long rifle into each platoon to engage targets a larger distance. The marksman was already aware of the target and had loaded his rifle in the meantime. When he finally was able to get a shot off, the scout was at a distance of roughly 250 yards, though that was not a problem for the rifle he wielded, which was a replica of the one Berengar had used to take out the assassins during his hunting trip. Slowly but surely, the dirty peasant, clad in earthly linen clothing, lined up his sights, took a deep breath, and squeezed the trigger. After a thunderous explosion and a puff of smoke, the mini-ball projectile was sent down range and pierced the back of the scout who was riding off to report to his master to inform him about the occupation of the mining town. A massive hole appeared in the man's torso as the mini-ball pierced through his brigandine breastplate as if it were made of single-weave linen. Ultimately, the horse was frightened by the blast, and with no concern for the rider which had fallen of its back bleeding out into the dirt below, rode off towards the castle from which it had come. When the horse returned without a rider, it immediately invoked suspicion. As such, Ulrich knew something had happened to the scout he sent to oversee the rumors of an occupying force at Mining Town. He had no idea how large the force was or who it belonged to, but an enemy force had seized the land right under his nose. This was an insult to his authority, and if he could not handle it himself, he would only lose the trust in the Baron whose son and heir he had just assassinated. His first course of action was to muster his troops. As a lowly lord, he only had a dozen or so knights under his command and at most 100 men at arms. Still, his warriors were well experienced, and he had little doubt what he was facing was merely a pack of brigands. When he finally arrived with his army, he was shocked to see many peasants armed with what appeared to be oddly shaped spears. He was unaware of the invention of the musket, or the earlier hand cannon for that matter. It was an especially rare piece of equipment during this time. As such, he vastly underestimated the forces in which Berengar's allies had brought to aid him. Lord Ulrich approached the fortifications and inquired about the identity of the peasant rabble who dared to offend him. "I am Lord Ulrich von Wildschonau. Under whose authority do you trespass on my territory and occupy my mines?" Eckhard stepped out in front of the defensive line and approached Ulrich. Unlike the rest of his troops, he was properly equipped with the munitions-grade half-plate armor prototype. Adorning his head was a Sturmhaube, or Burgonet, a type of helmet that would normally not be developed for the next century or two. Ludwig was able to sneak a few sets into production for the officers and NCOs of the militia. In Eckhard's hands was a musket with its bayonet attached, which he rested on the ground as he chatted with Ulrich. I am Esser Eckhard, retainer to Lord Berengar, son and heir of Siegfried von Kufstein, the Baron who presides over these lands. It is under his authority that I am here." Ulrich's face instantly turned ugly. This meant Berengar was still alive and somehow could muster such a force to come to his rescue. Things were not going well. Luckily Berengar would only know that Lambert was behind this plot and had no proof of his involvement. As such, Ulrich tried to play it cool. After all, the forces he was up against were practically 6 times the size of his own. Even if they were unarmored peasants armed with sticks and spears, such numbers still posed a threat. "As far as I'm aware, Berengar left back towards his home a while ago without paying proper respects. Why would he order you here?" Eckhard spit in the general direction of Lord Ulrich, which was an enormous slap to his face. "Cut the crap, my lord, we know you are responsible for the cave-in. I suggest you lay down your arms and surrender to justice. If you confess to the actions of the real mastermind behind this plot, I promise in the name of my liege, Berengar von Kufstein, you will be granted leniency." This response shocked and outraged Ulrich. There was no way of knowing that he was involved in this plot unless Lambert turned on him or someone in his employ did. Though why Siegfried would send this rabble to bring him to justice instead of his own army, Ulrich could not understand. The truth that he was incapable of understanding was this was Berengar's private militia and was fully capable of bringing down the lord and his army. Hell, they could even lay siege to his castle if they wanted to. Ulrich threatened Eckhard further in an attempt to strike fear into the hearts of the peasants who followed him. "When I return with my levies, I will teach you a thorough lesson in the art of war." Eckhard chuckled at Ulrich's comments, which thoroughly provoked the lord. "What's so funny?" Eckhard stared at Ulrich with a look of contempt as he spoke the blatant truth. "My lord, you could attack this position with tenfold the numbers you currently possess, and the result would still be the same. If you march on this position, only death awaits yourself and those who are foolish enough to follow. If you run and hide in your castle, I promise that we will follow you, and when we tear down those mighty walls in which you cower behind, I will personally see to it that Berengar is the one who rips you from your seat of power by the throat." Eckhard was clearly the victory in this war of threats that was currently ongoing between a fallen knight and the Lord of Wildschonau. The more Eckhard spoke, the more Ulrich was enraged by his words and made foolish comments. Really? How do you expect to accomplish this without any knights or men at arms?" Ulrich felt with this statement, he would make the militiamen under Eckhard's command back down. Still, when he looked in their eyes, he was shocked to find the same look of determination and disdain Eckhard had so boldly displayed in his presence. Were these peasants mocking him? Eckhard's final words to Ulrich before he retreated was this: "If you do not surrender, I swear to show you that the age of knights has already passed." With that statement spoken, Ulrich snorted at the remarks and returned to his holdings. While the excavation for Berengar's rescue was ongoing, the Lord of Wildschonau called upon the peasants in his territory and raised his levies with 1,500 men. Even if the cost of the battle was the death of all his levies, he makes certain to take Berengar's life. Chapter 30 Symphony of War. It took the entire night for Ulrich to raise his levies and properly equip them with what little equipment he could spare. It's not like their lives mattered to him in the slightest. Of course, the levies had no idea who they were fighting or why such a significant number of them had been conscripted. Most of them had never held a spear before in their lives. If they had known they were going against Berengar, the son and heir to the Baron of Kufstein, and were essentially acting in open rebellion, they probably would have taken a stand against Lord Ulrich. Unfortunately, they did not know their opponent and merely did what they were told in fear of persecution. As the sun rose on the next day, the sound of excavation could be overheard by the forces resting in their trenches. The rescue men worked day and night to free Berengar, and now they had finally achieved their goal. As the wall of rubble collapsed around Berengar and the light of their lamps shone into the room, he shielded his eyes, as his eyes were not adjusted to such brightness. Then he felt a hand clasp on his shoulder, and he looked up, barely making out the haggard old face of Ludwig, who was covered in soot. "My lord, I'm glad to see you're okay." Berengar began to chuckle and cough from the debris particles which filled the air. "Apparently, I'm hard to kill," he said with a wry smile on his face as Ludwig dragged the young lord to his feet and began walking him out of the mine shaft. "Aye, now let's get you to a field medic and see if we can do anything about those injuries of yours." After exiting the cave, Berengar saw the hundreds of volunteers and the militiamen cheering for him as if they were watching a general return from triumphant conquest. In either of his two lives, he had never witnessed such a scene before. Maybe he was a little too rash to lose his faith in the common people. Some fresh air did wonders for the clarity of his head as he sat down on a stool and had a field medic disinfect his wounds, which stung horribly as the distilled alcohol killed the bacteria that had begun to fester. The moment Berengar founded the militia, he was sure to start up a production line for first aid supplies and medic kits that those who became field medics could use to save lives on the battlefield. It was by no means a surgeon's kit, but it got the job done. He would never send an army to war without medics alongside them to aid the wounded. As such, the medics received both infantry training and basic medical training, or at least to the best that Berengar could remember. He never was trained as a proper medic. He just knew some basic first aid from his time fixing himself up after some scraps in his old life. After all, in his old life, the American health system was atrocious, and he'd sooner suture himself than go to the emergency room and shell out hundreds if not thousands of dollars for it. What he learned in his old life he passed on to his field medics so, at the very least, they could save some lives from minor injuries. After being treated by the medic, Eckhard approached him, who patted him on the shoulder and informed him of the situation. Lord Ulrich has conspired against you with your brother to bring your demise in these mines. The foreman we captured spilled everything he knew about their plot. Last evening Ulrich approached us and demanded we leave. Of course, we refused, and he vowed to return with levies. How should we proceed? Berengar was currently shirtless with many bandages wrapped around him. His body was covered in soot, grime, and dust, which blackened his otherwise flawless milky white skin. The pomade in his hair had collected the filth of the cavern, like moths to the flame. If one was not familiar with the young lord, they might have mistaken him for someone else. Berengar took a sip of water from the canteen he was provided and exhaled deeply. He felt like his entire mouth was filled with dirt and iron after inhaling the debris particles for the past few days. After gargling the water and spitting out the filth, he looked up at Eckhard with his reply. How should we proceed? We kill them all, of course. Every man who marches on this position is guilty of treason. I do not care if they simply follow orders. Let us show these traitors what happens when they march upon a trench line filled with 600 guns and the brave men who wield them. Berengar shouted his command loud enough for all the nearby militiamen to hear. Once more, the cheering began, but this was not the cheer of men thankful that their lord and commander was safe. This was the cheer of men who were about to lay waste to their enemies and who reveled in it. Though when Berengar stood up and raised his hand, silence quickly followed as he began his speech. I look around me, and who I see are not peasants, nor serfs, nor commoners, but the people of Kufstein, brothers, fathers, and sons. Under my leadership, we have made great progress towards a new era, where a man's worth is not determined by the class he was born into, but by the hard work and effort he puts into his community. Many of you have been raised from the life of a serf, breaking your back every day in the fields so that you may grow crops for your masters. Now you work in factories and are afforded good wages and proper living conditions. The men out there want to take my life, but more importantly, they want to take away the life you have made for yourself, which I have worked alongside you all to implement. I ask you not to put your lives on the line for some petty grievance in which I, your lord and commander, have suffered, but to preserve the way of life that we have all built and continue to work towards. Today is the day we stand up to those who would oppose the dawn of a new era, the dawn of the industrial era. Though it was not some epic speech of a lifetime, it was more than enough to rally the men who had begun to question their position in the line of defense and bolster their courage. As soon as Berengar had finished his speech, the enemy's horn roared in the distance, and with it, an army of 1,600 men came marching towards the fortifications. However, by now, the defenders were fully enthralled by the rallying cry of Berengar and would defend this position with their lives if need be. The militiamen rushed to their positions and began to load their muskets, rifles, and cannons. Berengar could not stand idly by, and walked over to Eckhard, who was busy commanding the forces to their positions. Major Eckhard, I require a musket, Berengar said in an authoritative tone to his second in command, which baffled the old knight. Berengar had not eaten in days. He barely had enough time to hydrate before the enemy showed up. He was covered in cuts and bruises. He was slightly concussed and had a fractured rib. Yet the filth-covered young lord stood there, demanded a musket so he too could join the action. Eckhard, of course, could not help but voice his complaints. "My lord, do you really think that's a good idea?" Berengar glared at Eckhard with a tyrannical stare as he boldly declared in front of his forces lined against the trenches with their muskets raised. "I will not sit idly by while the men under my command put their lives at risk in the face of the enemy. Now tell somebody to fetch me a musket." Eckhard could not help but admire Berengar's spirit. Even in his condition, he chose to fight and die alongside his troops. He was truly a young lord worth following. Before Eckhard could even bark the command, a man came over with a musket and paper cartridge box tied to a belt and presented them to Berengar while kneeling. "My lord, I have acquired what you asked." Berengar grabbed a hold of the equipment and attached the belt shortly after. He bit open a paper cartridge and began to reload his weapon. While he was in the process of it, he barked at the soldier who had brought him his weapon. "Rise. I do not need every soldier to kneel at me every time they are in my presence. A salute is fine enough. You should have learned this in your basic training." The man quickly snapped to attention and saluted. "Yes, my lord." Berengar returned the man's salute before giving him commands. "Good, now take me to the front lines. I want to be among the first line that gets a shot at these bastards." The militiaman was assigned to a support unit. He was initially thankful, but after seeing his lord and commander's enthusiasm for battle, he could not help but feel sorrow that he would not get to fight at the front line by the side with the young lord. After leading Berengar to the front line, the man returned to his support unit with a gloomy expression. Berengar, as the highest-ranking officer, had seized direct command of the front line, something in which the troops were pleased. Meanwhile, Ulrich stayed behind his troops with his houseguard. He was a cowardly man who refused to get his hands dirty on the field of battle. Alongside the house guard were the knights and men at arms. Essentially the entirety of his professional force. Ulrich's plans were simple. He would have the peasant levies charge at the enemy's defenses. After all, they completely outnumbered Berengar's militia. When the levies had removed the cavalry traps placed in front of the trench line, his knights and men at arms would ride through Mining Town and slaughter Berengar's remaining forces. While Berengar was covered in dirt, grime, and filth from the mines and had no proper armor, nor even a doublet to wear, Ulrich was covered head to toe in steel plate armor in the style which was common during this time, which would later be referred to as the Cherbourg style. Currently, the visor to his great bassinet was open as he watched his peasant levies march towards the fortifications. He had very few archers. However, once they were within range, they would rain a volley down upon the unarmored defenders, allowing his levies to rush towards the trenches. His plan was all supposed to go smoothly. It would allow him to defeat Berengar and his militia and cover his tracks successfully. So when his archers advanced into the 400-yard range, which was still far beyond their capabilities, he did not in the least expect the cannons that were hidden under cover would begin to rain fire upon them. When the 6 cannons echoed with thunder as the canister shot flew out of their bores and rained upon the archers, piercing their gambeson and mail armor as if it were made of tissue paper and scattering their limbs across the field, Ulrich nearly fainted from fright. He had never before witnessed cannons, let alone muskets. Instantly what little archers he had were decimated into piles of mincemeat, their bodies no longer recognizable. The first part of his plan was completely and utterly destroyed. However, the cannons did not stop there. They quickly reloaded and fired a second bombardment of canister into the peasant levies, reaping the lives of dozens, if not hundreds, in the process. Their blood flowed onto the fields like a river and fertilized it in the process. At this point, the morale had already been broken among the levies, and they began to panic. Even the warhorses of the knights and men at arms began to become frightened. As Lord Ulrich saw his ranks breaking, he swiftly commanded the knights and men at arms to hold the line at any cost. "If those peasant bastards start breaking ranks, ride them down. They will move forward or they will face the consequences." The knights and professional soldiers heeded their lord's command and rode down their own routing levies. Very quickly, the peasant levies began to understand where they stood and were pushed forward out of fear into the line of fire. Though the cannons continued to sound off, taking the lives of dozens if not hundreds with every step, the levies rushed through it, knowing their only way out was forward and into death. Even Ulrich figured once they got close enough, those frightening thunderous weapons would have no effect. Berengar, on the other hand, was making sure his men did not fire in panic. Instead, with each bombardment of the cannons, their morale grew rapidly. Many even stared dumbfounded at how effective their weapons were. "Hold your fire! Hold your fire! Do not fire until you see the whites in their eyes." This was a phrase Berengar continued to repeat to his musketeers as they held the line with their fingers firmly on the trigger. Despite the cannons blasting the ranks of the levies and the hundreds of losses, there were still close to 1,000 troops who rushed towards their position. The number was staggering and frightening. Nevertheless, they knew Berengar would not steer them wrong as they waited until they were given the command to fire. Finally, when the first line of Ulrich's levies were within 25 yards of the trench line, Berengar shouted at the top of his voice, "Fire!" With that, the echo of close to 500 muskets went off in unison, each musket ball finding its way into the body of an enemy. Limbs were torn apart, holes the size of a fist were punched through chests, and the blood-curdling screams of those unfortunate enough to survive filled the air as the militiamen rapidly reloaded their muskets. By now, the average militiaman could reload their musket within 20 seconds after all were reloaded, including Berengar's. He would give the commands of "Ready, aim," and "Fire," as the symphony of war continued to rage upon the battlefield. Despite losing hundreds of men with each volley, the peasant levies pushed on as their escape route was cut off by Ulrich and his professional soldiers, who by now would not dare move forward. Ulrich finally understood the absurd comment Eckhard had made to him the day prior: "The age of knights is already past," as he gazed upon the horrendous destruction wrought upon his army by Berengar's volunteer militia. Luckily he was out of range of these crazy weapons. He began to feel as if the wrath of God was raining upon him as his army collapsed and began to rout, no longer fearing the men at arms behind them that were essentially acting as Soviet commissars and reaping the lives of those who fled. Right as Ulrich was about to give the command to retreat, he once more heard the thunder of the cannons and the whistle of the shot in the air. However, this time, it was not a canister that was fired, but a solid ball. The 12-pound cannonball flew in his direction and punched through his chest, blowing his body apart. The lord who supported Lambert in his attempt to assassinate Berengar's life was completely and utterly dead. Berengar laughed as he saw the man's body torn apart by the massive cannonball, as he thought to himself, "Getting shredded by artillery fucking hurts, doesn't it?" Instantly conjuring up the scene of his death in his previous life. Nevertheless, Ulrich was now dead, and his forces were routing. The knights and men at arms knew better than to stay in the confines of Kufstein, where they had just acted in rebellion. As such, they took off on their horses, fleeing the barony and Tyrol altogether. Nobody would ever believe what they claimed to have witnessed on that battlefield, and it would be a long time before such a scene resurfaced. Meanwhile, Berengar could not get rid of the orchestra of war that had filled his ears throughout the battle, despite the loud cheers of his men celebrating a battle that was won without a single casualty. Berengar had an epiphany, and would one day in the distant future be quoted saying as follows: "It was on that day when 600 men defended their position with their guns thundering in the dawn that the Grim Reaper was conjured. When I saw his ugly face, I recognized that I was not a dealer of steel and textiles but thunder and death. At that moment, I came to a sudden realization about my fate. One day I would be emperor." Chapter 31: The Aftermath. After the battle had occurred, there was much cause for celebrating the overwhelming victory gained by the militia forces. Having gotten their first battle out of the way with the new weapons, the men comprised of Berengar's forces were entirely confident of defending their territory from any invading force, and more importantly, in Berengar's command. The fact that the young lord stood at the front lines facing down wave after wave of enemies alongside his troops would be spoken throughout the villagers of Kufstein for months to come. Berengar, on the other hand, promised a great celebration after they cleaned up the battlefield. They could not very well allow hundreds of corpses to lie on the fields to rot. As such, after much effort, the militia had dug a series of mass graves where they buried Ulrich and his forces. Berengar would have difficulty explaining his overwhelming victory to his father if he told the whole truth. Despite the desire to brag about his feats, he decided to lie about the battle and completely downsize the results. Because the men at arms and knights had by now fled the confines of the Barony of Kufstein, and the peasants who fought against them were round up, lined against the wall, and executed, there were no witnesses to the events that transpired aside from the forces loyal to Berengar. And as long as he gave the order to keep the telling of their war stories to what he had instructed, there should be no problems with the leaking of how effective his firearms were. The story Berengar told to his father about the attempt on his life by Ulrich, the mustering of his forces, how they built the defenses and defended the position from a few hundred peasant levies. The Lord's professional forces were very different from reality. Berengar spun the events, making it seem like Ulrich was unaware of hand cannons, and foolishly attacked the hill with a few men. The missing peasants were explained by running away from their homes and families in fear of reprisal from the Baron. It was a stretch, but judging by the fact that the knights and men at arms also fled the region, Sieghard had no choice but to believe it. After all, hand cannons were extremely effective against the peasant levies' light armor or lack thereof, and frightening to those who were not accustomed to the sound. As for the death of Ulrich, Berengar made it seem like a stray shot had pierced his skull when the visor to his helmet was open. With the Lord's death, his forces collapsed and routed. Sieghard sent a team to investigate the fields to confirm this information was true, but found no traces of the mass graves and only the small ones Berengar had used to mislead the Baron and his brother Lambert. As far as anyone was aware, the battle was quite small and was set between 200 of Berengar's militia dug in at the mining town and armed with hand cannons against 300 of Ulrich's men who fled with the accidental death their lord. After all, in this feudal world, it was considered unacceptable to kill a nobleman outright if it could at all be avoided. Men of higher birth were afforded the privilege of ransom. There was no mention of the use of cannons. Due to Berengar's previous misinformation, the cannons were considered to be static weapons and largely immobile by the uninitiated. Thus he did not want to reveal how effective they really were. After Ulrich's untimely demise, his son and heir, who was only a small child, was named Lord of Wildschonau. As he was so young, he needed a regent, which Sieghard placed from a dedicated member of his own court to ensure the loyalty of the young lord who was now his vassal. He would not allow the grieving widow of the boy's traitorous father to skew the future lord's allegiance to his liege. As for the foreman who was captured, he was Berengar's only viable witness in Lambert's schemes against him. However, unfortunately, as the man was led to the dungeons of the castle of Kufstein, he was shortly thereafter found dead from asphyxiation. It was ruled a suicide as the man had supposedly choked himself to death with the chains that bound him. Berengar, however, knew that this was clearly the work of Lambert and his allies cleaning up their mess. The only witness he had to his brother's ploy was Lind, and Berengar refused to play that card. She was a valuable spy not only against Lambert but her father as well. He would not expose such a precious asset against his enemies in a rash attempt to expose Lambert's machinations. It became apparent that his father's army and the guard had been compromised. Clearly, there was a faction loyal to Lambert among them, and such a force would need to be purged when Berengar finally came to power. It took a long time for Berengar to explain the volatile situation that had occurred to his father. By the time he was finally able to wash the dirt and grime off of his filthy body, it was late into the night. His paranoia that he had developed from being trapped in the darkness of the mine shaft for days began to take hold as he sat alone in the bath during the twilight hours. As he heard the door creak open and the light taps of footsteps approach his location, he felt like another assassin was nearing by. When the footsteps finally reached his vicinity, Berengar launched a surprise attack on the would-be assassin, dragging them into the pool of water and pressing their head beneath its surface. For whatever reason, it never occurred to him that Lind was entering his bath to be with the man she loved. After all, she had been beside herself the past few days as she waited for news of Berengar's situation. Every day that Berengar was trapped, she was overcome with anxiety and despair, to the point where she could barely maintain the facade of Lambert's ally. It took a few moments for Berengar to realize he was in the process of drowning his own lover. When he finally came to his senses, he quickly released his hands and allowed the divine beauty to resurface from the filthy bathwater, where she struggled to breathe. Berengar looked upon her with shock and terror, as he had acted upon instinct, and did not recognize what he was doing until after he had harmed Lind. The girl's sky-blue eyes were filled with tears as she stared at Berengar in fear. She could not help but ask why she was so severely punished. "What the hell? Why would you do that?" Berengar, who was in the middle of a panic attack because of his actions, struggled to breathe, which was incredibly painful due to his fractured rib. As such, he grabbed a hold of his side and winced in pain as he struggled to give the girl an explanation. I'm sorry, I thought you were an assassin." Lind gazed upon the deep sense of dread that was spread across Berengar's immaculate visage and instantly forgave him. She could not imagine the sense of distress and agony that Berengar had suffered while being trapped in the darkness of the mines by his lonesome for days on end, wondering when he would finally enter death's embrace. As such, she approached him cautiously and wrapped her warm body around his, placing her head on his shoulder. "I'm here for you if you want to talk about it." It was only after he felt the warmth and love of Linda's heavenly body that he began to calm himself down and realize that he was not still in the cavern waiting for death. He was finally home, and though there were enemies in his midst, those who loved and cared for him far outnumbered them. Quickly, the sense of paranoia and dread was changed to one of intense wrath as he gained control of his emotions and began to plot his brother's downfall. At the moment, he still did not have enough evidence to bring charges against the treasonous little brat. He had been on the defensive for too long against Lambert, and now he would conspire against his own little brother and bring the little bastard to justice. Yes, justice, not vengeance. He could not very well kill his own brother and be labeled a kinslayer for the rest of his days. If Berengar so desired, he could easily have his little brother assassinated by Lind, though that would not be good for his conscience. Berengar would not stoop so low as to engage in fratricide, at least at the moment. If Lambert truly crossed the line, there was nothing Berengar would not attempt if it meant achieving his goals. Instead, he would target his brother's allies and cut off Lambert's support one by one. Aside from the Count of Tyrol, Lambert's allies were largely among his father's vassals and the armies that supported them. If he could identify them, he would have a much easier time dispatching them to the afterlife. As such, he began to share his scheme with Lind, who was Berengar's most valuable asset in the shadow war with his brother. "My dear Lind, I have a task for you." Lind had sparkles in her eyes, though she had yet to be rewarded for her previous actions. She knew it was only a matter of time, and with a new task meant an even greater reward. As such, she instantly replied obediently, "Yes, master." Berengar narrowed his eyes. Within them contained a great sense of wrath and a desire for retribution. He was a man who would show no mercy to his enemies, and this recent attempt on his life had made him particularly vengeful, even if he told himself it was a desire for justice. "I want a list of names of every single person who has ever aided my brother in his attempts to gain the inheritance. Who they are, where they live, their weaknesses, and the extent to which they aided him. If someone so much as entertained the idea of taking my life, I want to know about it in exact detail. I trust this is something you can handle?" Lind nodded with a deep smile on her face as she cuddled up against Berengar. "Anything you require, master." Berengar gazed down at the peerless figure of the gorgeous young woman next to him and smiled deviously. By the way, I need to reward you for saving my life. Do you have any particular desires that I may fulfill?" Lind blushed at the words with embarrassment, though deep down she had been waiting for this moment, as such, sat atop his lap and began to make out with him. The remainder of the bath session was filled with sounds that, if overheard by others, would cause a great scandal. Nevertheless, those who dwelled in the castle noticed not a single noise as the couple enjoyed the time they spent together with great passion. By the time the two left the bathhouse, they returned to Berengar's chambers, where they spent the rest of their waking hours continuing their fun. On the other hand, Lambert was wide awake and filled with terror as he hid within the confines of his large stone room. The attempt on his brother's life had failed, and the foreman used his name during the act. If Berengar was unaware of his previous endeavors, then he was certainly aware now. Not only that, but one of his greatest allies was now dead, all because the fool carelessly had his visor open. Surely if the visor to his bassinet were closed, the rocks fired from the hand cannons would have glanced off, right? Of course, Lambert had no way of knowing the real way in which Ulrich had perished, nor was he aware that the lead balls fired from the musket would have penetrated the bassinet either way if fired from an appropriate distance. Instead, Lambert felt he caught an unlucky break. His plans were leaked to Berengar, possibly from someone under his command. Still, it could have also come from one of the many workers Berengar brought with him, who were suspicious of the foreman's actions. He had no way of knowing how the militia and rescue force arrived so quickly to Berengar's aid. All of these things contributed to the overwhelming sense of angst he felt deep in his stomach. Nevertheless, the worst part was that Lambert now had to fear his brother's reprisals, and with how things have been going lately, he could not help but be afraid of divine intervention on Berengar's behalf. Because he was unaware of Berengar's schemes to target his allies, the teenage boy dreaded an attempt on his own life by his elder brother as an act of retribution. Thus, while Berengar was enjoying his time with Lambert's fiancée, Lambert did not get a wink of sleep as he was too fearful of what might transpire while he slumbered. Chapter 32 Recovery. Adela struggled to fall asleep. A lot had happened in the last few days, and she recently only became aware that her fiancé had returned from the lordship of Wildschonau after a botched assassination attempt. Yet other than spending many hours explaining the exact situation to his father, Berengar made no attempt to visit her. Instead, he went straight to the bath to cleanse himself of the filth that he had garnered throughout the time in the cavern. Afterward, before she could approach him and check to see how he was feeling, he went to his bedchambers, where he was reportedly resting. The young girl had heard that Berengar was injured and needed rest, but she did not know to what extent. As such, she worried deeply about his health. The reality of the situation was Berengar's full attention during and after the bath had been captured by Lind, who was secretly bedding Adela's future husband behind the scenes. Nobody was aware of the illicit relationship between Berengar and Lind, especially not Adela. She was not the type of girl to accept her future husband to be playing around with other women, even if she was too young to take their place. Eventually, Adela could no longer take the heartache of being incapable of seeing her dearly beloved, who, as far as she was aware, was hospitalized in his room at the moment. As such, she got out of bed and dressed in a white lace nightgown that was appropriate for the time period. It was only after she had tidied her appearance did the young lady depart from her bed chambers and silently make her way to Berengar's room. Her actions, if spotted, would surely cause a misunderstanding, and rumors were bound to flare. Luckily for everyone involved, nobody had witnessed her depart from her quarters. She quickly found herself in front of Berengar's door, where her heart began to beat rapidly. She had never visited his room after hours before. She wondered if he was asleep or not. After taking a few moments to calm herself, she lightly knocked on the door. Berengar was in the middle of playing with his favorite toy when he heard a knock on the door. He was in no position to answer it at the moment, as there was a divine beauty, sitting atop his lap. He could not fathom who would possibly be at his doorstep at this hour aside from Lind. However, he made sure to motion with his hand to Lind to cease her activity and stay silent. After making sure the girl's lips were sealed, he just about called out to whoever was at the door when he heard a soft feminine voice with which he was all too familiar from behind the door. "Berengar, are you awake? Are you okay? I didn't get to see you when you returned. Can I come in?" Berengar quickly unsheathed himself from Lind and whispered in her ear with a voice so low Adela could not hear it from the other side of the door. "Get under the bed, and take your nightgown with you." Lind did not disobey his commands, albeit she was a bit frustrated she didn't get to finish. She quickly hopped off the bed and grabbed a hold of her nightgown, which was scattered across the stone tile floor. She then crawled under the bed where she barely managed to fit in the crawl space with her plump behind and buxom chest. Afterward, Berengar quickly put on a pair of trousers and answered the door. Adela was just about to leave when the door swung open. In her hand was an oil lamp that illuminated Berengar's bruised body, which caused Adela to become deeply concerned about his health. The young lady gasped when she saw the condition he was in and instinctively touched his abdomen to check to see if Berengar was okay. Berengar, who was desperately trying to hide his lower region behind the door, could not help but feel awkward as the little girl touched his bruised abs. Eventually, he could no longer contain it and broke the silence between the couple. Ahem, you know you shouldn't be here at this hour." Upon hearing Berengar's voice, Adela quickly realized what she was doing and retracted her hand away, where she tried to hide her sheepish expression. "I could not sleep knowing that you were injured. I wanted to check on your condition." Berengar looked at Adela as if she were a little angel. Unlike the vixen who currently lay under his bed which ran him ragged despite his injuries, this young lady was too stressed to fall asleep knowing that her fiancé may be seriously injured. Luckily for her, he was fine, aside from a cracked rib and a few bruises. Personally, he has had worse and barely noticed the pain except for when he laughed or breathed heavily, but he would never admit that to a pretty girl who was concerned about him. Berengar smiled, and he explained his situation to the young girl who was kind enough to check up on his condition even if it ruined her reputation. "I'm hanging in there. At the very least, it is nothing life-threatening. So you don't have to worry too much." Adela immediately felt relieved that her future husband was not in any danger and smiled endearingly at him. Well, that is good. Is there anything I can do to help? Berengar did not want to let the opportunity go to waste. It was a way to gain points with the little girl and tease Lind. As such, he invited the girl inside to his room to talk. Do you mind coming in? Since you are here, I have some things I want to talk about in regards to our engagement ceremony. Adela's cheeks became flushed as she heard the offer. It was completely inappropriate for a girl like her to be in a boy's room after dark. Well, it was inappropriate for her to be alone with a boy in his room, period, but she had already done that several times. On the other hand, Lind heard the words, engagement ceremony, and instantly began to scowl as she thought to herself. Ceremony? What ceremony? Is he throwing a party to celebrate his engagement? Why was I not invited? Why don't I get one? Why is Master making me listen to this? How cruel. Her scowl instantly turned into a pout as she felt left out. She knew she was only his concubine, but it still pained her heart every time she saw Berengar act flirty with his future wife. Luckily for her, Adela refused the offer. I'm sorry, Berengar, I don't think that would be appropriate. I'll see you tomorrow. With that said, the little girl in Twintails ran off back towards her quarters. It was quite an adorable sight, seeing her run off in embarrassment. Despite that, Berengar said his thoughts aloud as he shifted his attention to Lind, who was crawling out from under the bed. Maybe I teased her a bit too much. What do you think? When he saw tears starting to form in the girl's eyes, he could not help but laugh to himself. Did I tease you too much too? After he said that, he held the girl in his arms and carried her back to his bed, where he spent his waking hours making it up to the young woman. Before he knew it, a whole month had passed, and Berengar could no longer feel any pain in his ribs. Though he would still try to take it easy for the next 2 weeks, he was essentially healed from his injuries. During this time, things went as planned. The mines were overhauled completely and seized by the von Kufstein family in reparations for the attempt on Berengar's life. The von Wildschonau family suffered greatly from the loss of the mines, their professional army, and 1,500 peasants, which, despite the rumors that they had all died at the skirmish at Mining Town, nobody had ever found any trace of the mass graves. Berengar was truly a master at hiding bodies. Berengar's exploits were advancing wonderfully. By now, the fields within the vicinity of the town of Kufstein were fully irrigated, his chemical laboratory was up and running, and he began to produce various things within it. Though he still lacked a dedicated team of chemists to work full-time on chemistry, he managed to work on some small projects when he found the time. His flax farms and textile factory were either fully operational or close to completion. The labor force of Kufstein had grown quite rapidly after the implementation of irrigation, which allowed Berengar to open up a separate production line for agricultural equipment like the steel plow, the combine harvester, seeder, etc. On the other hand, after the skirmish at the mining town, the volunteer militia was on a recruiting spree. They barely had enough time to equip their soldiers properly. By now, Berengar's artillery battery was full, and he had a total of 800 infantry. He was getting very close to his goals. His spy network had produced great results, as Lind was able to uncover a long list of names of those who were in bed with Lambert, and Berengar was currently in the process of figuring out who to conspire against first. Lind had even managed to spread the web that was his informants to the other regions of the Barony of Kufstein. Rumors began to spread of the heroism Berengar showed in the face of death, how he was no longer a sickly lord, and how he was a benevolent lord to his people. This was all due to the network Lind had set up. She wanted to get rid of those filthy rumors regarding her lover as quickly as possible. Though they still prevailed among the nobility, many of whom had met Berengar in the past and had poor first impressions. The common people were more inclined to believe the rumors Lind spread, how he survived an assassination attempt only to lead a volunteer force of peasants armed with hand cannons to defeat the professional forces of Lord Ulrich von Wildschonau. Of course, the rumors she spread were greatly under-exaggerated at first. Over time, they had evolved to a point where they practically mirrored the truth of the battle. Currently, Berengar was observing himself in the bathroom mirror. It had been a little over 3 months since he had been reincarnated in this world. He started out as a borderline emaciated, sickly youth. Now he had grown firmly into his body, which was well toned with muscle, and though lean, he looked extraordinarily fit. He figured with the way this body was designed, he would never be as muscular as his past life, but that was fine, considering his princely face would not look well combined with the hyper-masculine body of a soldier. It would be a damn shame to ruin his regal appearance with the obsession of becoming a warrior again. He was not a soldier in this life, but a nobleman, and one day maybe even an emperor. His ambitions had grown wildly since the battle with Ulrich's forces. He had no desire to be Holy Roman Emperor. Instead, he had the desire to carve an empire of his own from the German-speaking regions. It was still 4 centuries too early for the German Empire to come into existence, but he would speed up the process in this timeline. As a man of German descent in his previous life, and an Austrian noble in this life, he felt it was his destiny to unite the German people into one cohesive empire. He was a strong believer in the concept of the nation-state and felt that complex multi-ethnic, multilingual empires were a lot more difficult to manage and would eventually become unstable. He did not know why, but seeing his peasant forces crush the feudal army of his enemy awoke something in him. He felt it would be a damn shame to squander his knowledge in a small region like a barony. After all, in all of the strategy games he played in his old life, he was never content with being in charge of a minor nation. For now, those lofty ambitions would have to wait. His engagement ceremony was in a few days, and it would be an exceptional occasion. Not only were his father's vassals and their families going to arrive in Kufstein, but also the Count of Steiermark and his family, as well as the Count of Tyrol. Lind forced Berengar's hand, and thus he invited her father to arrive, not because she particularly cared about respecting the alliance his family had forged with her father, but because she wanted an official invitation, rather than just being present. She no longer cared about her father's ambitions. He was not a man fit to be duke, let alone king, but in her eyes Berengar was. By now, some of the families had already arrived and were lodging in Sieghard's estate. He was deeply concerned about a lack of rooms for guests, and as such, during the past month, he had a special lodging area built for the excessive amounts of families who would be arriving. The areas were essentially chattias designed by Berengar. They appeared similar to castles but did not have the defensive structures and were quite luxurious. They could very well afford the expense after the massive sale of steel. After Berengar had finished admiring his appearance in the mirror and gotten properly dressed in his opulent attire, he slicked back his hair with pomade and left the bathroom. Today was a new day, and he had many guests to greet alongside Adela. There were also many on the list of his enemies that appeared, and he would do his best to come to know their weaknesses in the following days. Not a single soul who plotted against him would escape his fury. Chapter 33 Tea Time. Berengar was holding Adela's hand as he walked side by side with her into the dining room, where many of the guests visiting for their engagement ceremony were currently staying and enjoying a lavish meal. The noblemen and women of various stature could not help themselves from complimenting the chefs and the fine cuisine they had served to the guests. Of course, it was all of Berengar's favorites and the culinary knowledge he brought with him from his previous life. Though certain foods were missing from the dishes due to the inability to source them, the main staples of what would become German cooking were all spread out in a feast for the lord and ladies to enjoy at their leisure. When Berengar entered the room, he was wearing a fine black velvet doublet with golden embroidery. Worn over the doublet was an exquisite sleeveless black fur coat. His trousers were matching black velvet and were well tailored, and he currently wore knee-high leather riding boots, all of which were recently made. Atop his neck and over his shoulders was a golden chain embellished in black gemstones. His extravagant attire was recently manufactured in his fledgling textile industry and was in the style of the Tudor era, which had yet to exist in this timeline. To the medieval lords and ladies who gathered in the room, his Renaissance-style attire was new and luxurious. The moment the nobility laid their eyes upon the young lord and his unique fashion sense, they could not help but feel astonished and envious at the same time. Was this really the sickly and petty young lord they all knew? Though they had all heard the rumors of Berengar's recent transformation, none of them had truly believed it until the moment they laid eyes upon him. Adela, of course, was standing next to him, holding his hand and wearing a Tudor-style dress in the same black and gold color scheme. Despite her age, she appeared quite ravishing standing next to her betrothed. Many of the eligible bachelors instantly became furious that a lowly baron's son like Berengar had snatched up such a fine young woman. They could not understand what the Count of Steiermark was thinking, allowing his youngest daughter to be wed to the son of a family of such low nobility. Of course, Otto was not the only count marrying one of his daughters to Sieghard's sons. With the arrival of the Count of Steiermark and the Count of Tyrol came many of their subjects paying respects to their lieges and their attendance at what would normally be a local affair. There were far more nobles at the occasion than what was initially projected, and there were many more to come in the following days. From Steiermark and Tyrol, nobles of all positions could be found in Kufstein at the moment, many of which were not even aware of Berengar's existence before his engagement to Adela. Still, they did their best to appease him, as they could tell by the presence of two counts at a celebration that he personally called for, that perhaps one day Berengar would become an important figure in the Duchy of Austria. Lind was standing in the crowd next to Lambert as she watched Berengar and Adela arrive in the newly designed fashion with a great deal of envy in her heart. Why had Berengar not presented her with such a fine dress? Obviously, she knew it would not be appropriate for him to do so, and if she waltzed around wearing such a fine dress, her father and fiancé would immediately become suspicious of where she had acquired it. Yet the young woman could not prevent such feelings as she gazed upon Berengar and his future bride standing in the middle of the dining hall basking in the glory. Just as Berengar had planned, the nobles saw the luxurious new outfits Adela and himself were sporting and could not help but approach the two and inquire about where they purchased such fine clothing. Of course, Berengar revealed that it was designed and manufactured in his family's territory within the new textile factories he personally owned. If the nobility wanted to purchase the new fashion designs for themselves, they would have to negotiate with him personally. Thus a new and lucrative trade was born on the spot. Through much effort and expense, Berengar had begun to grow flax and had imported a great deal of the material alongside silk to produce these designs. Though at the moment, the flax was still growing and had yet to be harvested. The factory was fully constructed. However, it was currently operating at minimum capacity, as only a single unit of each of the new inventions was set in the large building. Those inventions include the spinning jenny, the spinning mule, the flying shuttle, and the water frame. Considering his industrial district was built near the river Inn, he had ample water power to use in both the steel and textile industries. As of now, he could only produce a small quantity of clothing, but it was more than enough to appease the nobles in front of him and their desires to buy the new style of fashion in which Berengar had personally introduced. Though now was not the time to talk business, instead, it was the time to build alliances and conspire against his enemies. Berengar and Adela spent much of the day socializing with the other nobles. In this feudal era, building alliances were important. Berengar sat at the head of the table as he associated with the other young nobles, drinking fine chamomile tea as he snacked on apple strudel and Lebkuchen cookies. The other nobles of his age were delighted by the delicacies in front of them, which Berengar boasted of being the invention of the local chefs. He would not take credit for too many things, else nobody would believe him. A young lady who was quite attractive could not help but exclaim in joy as she tasted pfeffernusse for the first time. Adela, you are so lucky. I would be so happy if I could snack on such treats each day. Adela could not help but smile at the compliment. The truth was she was quite used to snacking on these things. She had even begun to exercise more to maintain her petite physique. She would never want to become fat and unattractive in Berengar's eyes. Berengar, on the other hand, goaded the girl on and handed her a slice of cheesecake. Try this. I promise you will love it. The young lady who had a passion for pfeffernusse tasted the German cheesecake and immediately fell in love with it. Lind was observing Berengar's behavior while snacking on her favorite foods at the other side of the table. She was not as into sweets as Adela was and preferred the actual meals, like schnitzel. As long as she could get a good Jaeger schnitzel with a side of spätzle and a good lager to go with it, she was satisfied. That just so happened to be Berengar's favorite meal, too. Of course, a crucial component of the meal was missing, but Lind had no way of knowing it. The more Berengar ate his favorite food, the more he missed the potato pancakes and chocolate desserts that he grew up with as a staple in his previous life's household. He desperately wished he could speed up time to send out an expedition to South America and get his hands on cocoa and potatoes. However, patience was a virtue, and whether he liked it or not, he would have to wait until he had enough power, influence, and wealth to sponsor such a voyage. Thus he opted to enjoy the fine cuisine in front of him as he was thankful he could dine on such treasures regularly. On the other hand, Lambert was surrounded by his allies, who all began to chat among themselves about the lack of a certain lord who was a core part of the alliance. A young man in which Berengar recognized as Esser Ingbert Heltzer was currently conversing with Lambert about Ulrich's absence. Is it true? Was Ulrich killed by a stray projectile fired by a hand cannon in the hands of a peasant? Lambert could not help but furrow his brows and facepalm at such a remark. He had no way of knowing if his brother's claims were true, as nobody could find Ulrich's body. Officially, Berengar was so disgusted with Ulrich's behavior that he left his body for the wolves. Though the men beneath Berengar's command all confirmed the story was true, there was no way of knowing precisely how Ulrich had perished in battle without a body. However, as far as his father was concerned, Berengar spoke the truth, and as such, Ulrich was condemned as a fool who had marched upon an entrenched enemy position and had met his fate at the hands of Lady Luck. The lordship of Wildschonau was in a rough state at the moment. A large portion of their workforce had disappeared overnight. They had no professional army to call upon in the event of a war. The von Kufsteins seized their largest source of income, and a small child was at the head of the household. The child lord was present for this ceremony, accompanied by his regent, who the von Kufsteins appointed. This said a lot about how the feudal overlords currently viewed the von Wildschonau family. Truthfully, they got off easy compared to others who have attempted something similar in the past. The fact that Ulrich's family was still in possession of most of their lands and their lives was a testament to the benevolent nature of Sigurd. Still, the result of Ulrich's attempt on Berengar's life made many of the other lords and knights in Lambert's corner hesitant to provide any more support than they already have. If it weren't for the Count of Tyrol backing Lambert, most of his support would have vanished after Ulrich's death. Despite supporting Lambert, the Count of Tyrol was absolutely livid at the boy's repeated failures to get the job done. Looking upon Berengar, how healthy he appeared, how graceful he was when talking with the other lords and ladies, and how prosperous his industries were becoming, the old count could not help but feel like he had backed the wrong horse. Who was the idiot who told him that Berengar was a sickly, idle fool? If he had known the truth about Berengar sooner, he would have engaged his beloved daughter to him instead. Damn that Lambert for deceiving him. However, the more Count Lothar watched Berengar, the more he came to realize that he desperately needed to install Lambert on the throne. Even if it were possible for him to switch sides now, he would not do so. Every word Berengar spoke to the other nobles was carefully chosen to present himself in a better light. The young man was cunning, too cunning. It was obvious to Lothar that even if he could marry his beloved daughter to Berengar, the young lord would not be so easily fooled into giving up Kufstein's iron reserves, in which Count Lothar desperately needed to achieve his greater ambitions. What Lothar needed was a pawn, and Lambert fit that role perfectly. The boy was exceptionally eager to give up his family's most valuable resources so that he could be with the Count's daughter. It was truly and utterly pathetic, yet Lothar still agreed to the betrothal of his dearest daughter to the pitiful Baron's son anyway, for he would never become Duke of Austria without Kufstein's iron reserves. As Count Lothar was inspecting Berengar with his discerning eye, so too was Berengar examining Count Lothar. Currently, the Count of Tyrol was the greatest threat to Berengar's existence. Though the Count's daughter had fallen under his control, and Berengar could expect to be one step ahead of the Count, and his brother, the young lord, did not feel safe knowing that such a powerful man was after his life. Nevertheless, he did not display a hint of his internal hostility towards the Count. As Lambert was discussing with his allies the loss of their partner in crime, one of the young ladies fawning over Berengar brought up the tale of his battle with Ulrich. By now the rumors had spread far and wide and had become greatly exaggerated. The rumor had now become so inflated that even his actual accomplishment no longer seemed so impressive. Berengar, I heard that you personally commanded an army of 100 men while previously wounded from the attempt on your life against an army led by that dastardly Ulrich who had over 2,000 of his own troops. Surely the mad man must have emptied his fields to take your life. Berengar struggled to maintain his composure as he heard the absurd lengths the rumors had reached. He was good, but not that good. He had to correct this mistake while still making it seem like his feat was grand. Thus he decided to tell the whole truth, of course. To the many observers who were aware of the official numbers, what Berengar was about to say would seem like he was conceding ground, to appear humble while still greatly exaggerating the battle. I'm afraid I'll have to disappoint you. The reality of the situation was that I was facing 1,600 men, with 600 of my own. Still, with our hand cannons, we gunned down hundreds of their men before they finally broke ranks and fled like the cowards they were. The girl did not seem disappointed in the slightest. Instead, she had sparkles in her eyes as she heard the exact details of the battle from the man himself. Granted, he did not deny the part of him being grievously injured, despite only having minor injuries and dehydration. On the other hand, Lambert nearly spat out his drink when he heard his brother's wild claim. The way Berengar espoused such a hyperbolic tale was without a hint of dishonesty on his face. Either Berengar was the greatest bullshitter Lambert had ever seen, or he was actually telling the truth. The youth struggled to wrap his head around what was real and what was dishonesty. Ultimately, the meeting between the various nobles and Berengar was split into two factions sitting across the table as if battle lines were drawn. Those who supported Berengar tended to be of the younger generation, few of which had already succeeded their fathers. Most were heirs like Berengar or even second sons. The other faction supported Lambert, and most of them were of the older generation, those who were currently in a seat of power and had been for some time. If one were not aware of the deadly war of intrigue fought in the shadows of these two brothers, then they would not understand the full context of the seating arrangement that had occurred. Either way, the friendships Berengar made at this table with the younger generation of nobles from across Austria would one day become the backbone of his power base. Chapter 34. There is something else. Throughout the day, Berengar entertained his guests with his fiancée well nearby to make him look good. She was cordial and graceful in every regard, a proper partner to Berengar's natural charm. The two built quite the lasting impression on the nobles who visited the von Kufstein family's estate. He had begun to make progress in forming alliances with the capable youth of the younger generation. He had no use for an ally who could not pull his own weight as such. Berengar would not waste his time with the indolent and frivolous young lords and ladies who could not even count to 10. Sadly, it appeared like they were the majority of the noble offspring throughout the realm. He, too, had once been like them, spoiled rotten and never using his brain. Most of the people Berengar entertained were either the offspring of barons or viscounts from throughout the counties of Steiermark and Tyrol. They were roughly in the same position as he himself and could provide sufficient support to his plans if he were to build an alliance with them. Sadly, there were not too many exceptional members of the lower nobility in this generation, and they mostly clung to the corner, forming a small social clique among themselves. Most barons who were not their direct liege would not give them the time of day due to their low status, let alone viscounts or counts and their families. Currently, Berengar did not have time to oversee his projects personally. As such, he left them in the capable commands of administrators he placed in charge of them. Ludwig, as per usual, was in charge of his burgeoning industrial sector, Gunther was tasked with implementing his many agricultural innovations, and Eckhard took personal command of the matters that pertained to the militia. As for the militia, their activities were suspended during the duration of the visitors' stay. Berengar could not very well have information leaked about the effectiveness of his weapons. Such a thing could prove disastrous to his plans. As such, the militia was given a slight reprieve from the arduous task of basic training. Though they had been victorious in a single battle, it was against mostly poorly equipped levies, who foolishly rushed a well-entrenched position. The troops in Berengar's battalion still had to complete basic and specialized training if they were to become an army fully capable of annihilating their enemies in the fields. Though they were far more accepting of their training and its methods after personally witnessing the results they had yielded during that fateful day when they slaughtered Ulrich's forces and rescued their commander. It was a story many of them would be telling their grandkids someday in the distant future. The next few days, he would be busy socializing with the nobility visiting for the massive party he was celebrating for Adela. He had a large surprise in mind for the young girl. He decided it was about time to introduce some Renaissance-era culture, particularly ballroom culture, which would not come about naturally for at least another century. Of course, Berengar only knew one dance from his previous life, the waltz, so it might be fairer to say he would be implementing an aspect of early modern culture. Berengar did not have time or permission to extend the castle to contain a ballroom. As such, he built a public platform in the town square for the occasion. Eventually, he would like to construct a more modern palace that would obviously contain such a necessity and do away with the castles altogether. After all, once his weapons spread across Europe's great powers, the mighty stone walls of the medieval era would become obsolete. Though he had no plans to sell his weapons to others, it was only a matter of time before they were recovered and reverse-engineered, at least to some extent. It might take years or even decades at the current pace of things, but muskets and cannons would rule the battlefields of Europe far earlier in this timeline than in his old life, and when they did, large castles would become a thing of the past. Lately, Berengar had been drafting plans in his spare time to turn Kufstein into a functioning city. It was a distant dream at this point, but one he intended to make a reality within his lifetime. If he were to achieve his aspirations, he would need a grand city to be his seat of power, and he refused to leave behind his family's lands just because other areas were more developed. At the moment, Berengar found himself working on the layout for the proposed city of Kufstein. It was late at night, and his guests had retired for the evening. He had even sent Adela to her room, who was exhausted after socializing with the noble families who had arrived early. Currently, an oil lamp illuminated the large stone room in which he resided. It was just about midnight, and any moment now, he could expect a knock on his door and a particularly jealous Lind to appear and demand her share of attention for the day. After all, she had to sit in Lambert's corner and could not converse with her lover throughout the time, all while watching him act lovingly towards Adela. Sure enough, the knock came on the door, and when Berengar opened it, he found Lind with an adorable pouting expression as she forced her way into his room and jumped into his embrace. However, before she could kiss Berengar's lips, he raised a hand and blocked her attempt before sitting down upon the bed and motioning for her to sit next to him. Their nightly fun could wait. He had important matters to discuss with his spymaster. Lind, never one to refuse one of Berengar's orders, sat down next to him and latched onto his arm, and buried it into her bosom while wearing a wide smile on her face. Berengar, who was used to the vixen's antics by now, did not react in the slightest and merely continued with his train of thought. So your father appears to be displeased with my brother. Lind could not help but chuckle at the statement. It was true that her father was currently furious with Lambert. Not only had he failed once again to assassinate Berengar, but he also managed to cost Lothar a serious amount of raw materials. After all, Ulrich had been digging up more iron than he had reported to his liege and was selling it on the side to Lothar at a lowered price. It was part of the alliance they had reached. Now that Ulrich was dead and his mines confiscated by Sigurd, he was no longer getting a regular shipment of iron from Kufstein. Thus his plans to equip his armies with the best weapons and armor around had begun to come to a halt. Though the Count could acquire iron from other regions, he had already invested heavily in his alliance with Lambert and wanted a return soon. Lind was aware of all of this and could not help but laugh at the fact that her lover's enemies would never be able to accomplish their objectives. Father is furious with your little brother. However, that also means he is going to be pressuring Lambert into acting against you again. This time try not to get caught in their trap. I don't know what I would do without you. Berengar noticed the distressed look on the girl's face and began to pat her head to comfort her. I admit that I was careless last time. I promise you I will not make such a mistake again. Lind could not help but smile at the promise he made. There was a fierce look of determination in Berengar's eyes, which she took as a sign that he would stay true to his words. Afterward, Lind spoke her greatest concern that had been bothering her all day, but she had no way to inform Berengar until now. There is something else. Berengar raised his brow. By the way the beautiful young woman was acting, it was something serious. As such, he poured himself a glass of wine while offering one to the heavenly beauty next to him. However, to his surprise, she refused. Instead of accepting the wine, she glanced up at him with an unyielding gaze while resting her hand on her abdomen. I am pregnant? It took a moment for those words to register in Berengar's brain. As he nonchalantly took a sip of wine, however, while in the middle of drinking the red wine, he realized what she had said and nearly choked upon it. He stared at her in disbelief as he struggled to understand her words. You are what? Lind turned back to a pouting expression as she saw that Berengar was not as excited as she was. In fact, he was deeply concerned about the whole situation. You heard me. I am pregnant. You are going to be a father. Berengar did his best to maintain his composure as he slowly drank his wine while maintaining a dignified appearance. This was not something he expected, of course, with the way those two had been going at it every night for the past month and a half. It was something he seriously should have anticipated. His brain rapidly thought of a solution. After all, she was not even married to her fiancé yet. That alone would be a scandal, but the truth of the matter was her fiancé was not the father. If anyone found out about that, her reputation would be ruined for life. Berengar had to prevent that from happening for multiple reasons. Chiefly among them is that it would seriously damper his diplomatic relations if people found out he had been fooling around with his little brother's betrothed. After several moments of intense thought, he finally came to the best conclusion he could think of. Say it is Lambert's, he said sternly as he ordered his lover like a domineering master. She was shocked. Deep down, she hoped Berengar would officially recognize the child and make it a legitimate bastard. That way, it would have a claim to his titles, and she would not have to marry Lambert. Instead, he said something which sounded asinine, and she immediately voiced her concerns. Lambert? Even if I said it was his, he would never believe me. I have never slept with him. Berengar glared at the girl menacingly. The thought of his brother touching his lover enraged him to the core. His voice was slightly raised as he chastised her. And you never will. Realizing that he had raised his voice, Berengar calmed himself down and exhaled deeply before putting on a wide smile and touched Linda's frightened face with his firm but loving palm. You don't need him to sleep with you to make him think it is his. Get him really drunk, strip his clothes off and lie down next to him. When he wakes up in the morning, tell him that the two of you slept together. Make it look convincing. Spill some blood on the sheets, so he doesn't suspect anything. Afterward, he kissed his lover for several moments before apologizing. I'm sorry, I know your desires for the future of our child, but I'm in a precarious situation right now. I don't have the luxury to take responsibility for this at the moment. Maybe one day I can proclaim to the world that this child is mine and the love we have for each other, but for now, it is not in the cards. Please understand. Lind wiped away a tear that had been forming in her beautiful sky-blue eyes. Before nodding in acceptance to Berengar's request. I understand, and I will do what you have asked. Afterward, the couple spent the night together in each other's embrace, celebrating the conception of new life. Completely unaware of the troubles that would follow because of the birth of this child. After all, who could know the distant future? Chapter 35: A Night to Remember. Several days had passed since Berengar initially found out that he would soon be a father, and so far, the couple had not told a soul. Currently, Berengar was having breakfast and entertaining his guests alongside Adela. It was the day of his engagement ceremony, and all of the invited nobles had safely arrived in Kufstein. During these past few days, Berengar had schemed with Lind to set up her fiancé as the official father to her child. The plan would go into effect tonight. Lambert's 16th birthday was nearly a month away, and she would push for a wedding as quickly as possible to conceal the fact that the pregnancy was out of wedlock. Something in which her father would go through great lengths to hide. If successful, the only people who would be aware of the child's true lineage were the parents themselves. Berengar had become quite the expert in maintaining his social grace among the elites of Austria who were gathered at his family's estate. By now, all of the undesirable rumors about him had begun to fade in the minds of those at the party. They had become well accustomed to the new and improved Berengar. During this time, Berengar did not stand idly by and merely entertain his guests. He had set in place several transactions for steel and textiles, which would bring in quite a fair degree of wealth for his family. These trade agreements would eventually blossom into friendships and perhaps even alliances one day. With each passing day, his father looked more favorably upon him. Berengar was certain that the day until he has officially declared regent of his family's lands was near. Currently, he was engaged in discussion with his future father-in-law about the state of affairs of his steel-making industry. Rest assured, Count Otto, we are working on improving the production rate of steel. We have already begun to implement a second production line in our industrial district. Before long, we will be able to produce twice the amount of steel that we are currently able to manage. Essentially, what Berengar meant was that more beehive ovens, blast furnaces, and Bessemer converters were currently undergoing production. With the decrease in needed farmhands, many unemployed farmers were actively transitioning to factory work or skilled trades. With each passing day, the town of Kufstein was transforming from a small agricultural town to an actual city, filled with a wide degree of diversity in professions. The Count smiled as he heard the news. He would continue to purchase steel from Berengar. After all, the quality and quantity of the steel Berengar produced far outmatched anyone else he knew of. Though Berengar had plans to use the steel in many aspects, he still sold off the surplus to those interested, and there were plenty who wanted a piece of the pie. The Count now decided to switch to a more personal topic to make sure Berengar was a good match for his youngest daughter. Are you attracted to my daughter? Berengar did not expect such a question. Nevertheless, he could not honestly say that she was too young for him to get excited over. Otherwise, Adela might take it the wrong way, and she was carefully observing his reaction. For some time now, she had been suspecting that Berengar thought of her as a little kid, or even worse, a little sister. He never gazed at her the way she saw him stare at Lind during the night of their first encounter, and that bothered her. She is quite the beautiful young lady, with many years ahead of her to mature into her body. Berengar's response to Count Otto's question was satisfactory for the old nobleman, but to Adela, she could tell what he really meant and pouted at the answer as she muttered under her breath. Stupid Berengar." Though nobody had heard her dissatisfied statement, Berengar could tell by the expression on the young girl's face that she was sulking. It became apparent to him that she had understood his hidden meaning in the statement. Count Otto, on the other hand, nodded his head slowly and accepted his words. "Good, it is important for a couple to be attracted to one another. I know I certainly would have never married my wife if she was a dog-faced woman." Berengar nearly laughed at the statement and the look upon his wife's face, who was sitting next to the count as she heard her husband's words. Count Otto was a slim man well into his 40s, he had short golden blonde hair and a clean-shaven face. However, unlike his daughter, he had emerald green eyes. It was the countess whom Adela had inherited her deep sapphire eyes from. A trait in which was commonly shared between Berengar and the two of them. After all, Adela's mother was Berengar's aunt and had thus come from the same gene pool as Berengar and his family. Berengar's aunt was named Wanda and had married the count many years ago. Much like her daughter, she was also quite young when she was betrothed to her husband, and he was considerably older than her. Thus she was in the middle of her 30s, and like all members of Berengar's family, was quite attractive. The family would enjoy their meal and entertain the guests until the mid of the day. Afterward, Berengar successfully slipped away from the endless number of guests who were at Kufstein with the sole purpose of visiting him. He tried to decompress from the stress of talking to so many unknown people for so many hours. It was not until the start of the feast that Berengar finally re-emerged from his solitude. The feast was held outside in the center of the town. It was a fine spring evening, and a gentle breeze in the air enhanced the wholesome atmosphere. There was a gated area that contained a variety of tables and dishes atop them. Many noblemen and women were enjoying their food, wine, and beer as they engaged in conversation. It was not until Berengar stood up from his chair and led Adela over to the large dance floor erected under his orders. He was dressed in a particularly dazzling outfit for the evening, and standing beside him was Adela, who was equally lavishly dressed. Berengar held onto the girl's hand and asked her a question she was not expecting. In front of the audience, which caused her to become slightly embarrassed. "May I have this dance?" She did not know how to respond and nodded her head in curiosity. As such, Berengar took her up on the dance floor in front of all of the nobles who were watching with inquisitive gazes. Their sight cast upon Berengar and Adela as the couple waltzed together to the music which played in the background. Though Adela was unaware of the intricacies of the waltz, she quickly caught on as Berengar led her through the paces. As the sun began to set, the two danced together throughout the early night under the illumination of 1,000 candles and the full moon above. Though the men in the audience initially scoffed at the sight of the couple dancing, the women were instantly inspired by the extraordinary sight and quickly became envious of Adela. Soon enough, they asked their partners to take them up to dance as well. Though they did not know the waltz, they still participated in traditional folk dances of the regions they were from. From the sidelines, peasants gazed upon the various feudal powers of the regions as they engaged in a new tradition with various expressions. Some were envious, others were confused, and a few were just downright disinterested. Though one thing was certain to the townsfolk of Kufstein, Berengar was at it again with his crazy ideas. Adela quickly became entranced by Berengar's wide smile as she danced the night away with him. It was only after a couple of hours of dancing and socializing when the two finally sat down. Many of the couples present continued to dance as the young lord and his fiancée sat back down at the head table. Lambert had offered to dance with Lind, but she outright refused. If she were going to dance with any man, it would be Berengar. Of course, she could not outright say that, so she stated that she thought the whole act was childish. Berengar, on the other hand, had just begun his ploy to set up his little brother. As such, he brought over a couple of mugs of beer and ordered the servants to keep them coming. "Come, Lambert, let us drink in celebration of the upcoming union of your dearest elder brother." Lambert's eyes instantly narrowed as he looked at Berengar with a great deal of suspicion. By now, Berengar was fully aware of the plots against him. Yet he was so cheerfully offering to drink with him in public. What was his angle? Nevertheless, Lambert could not refuse and cautiously took a sip from the beer. When he confirmed it was not poisoned, he began to drink more. After all, these last couple of days had been extremely tiresome for him, as Count Lothar was constantly berating him for his failures. Before long, Lambert finished his drink, as did Berengar, and thus the young lord motioned for 2 more drinks to be brought to the table as he goaded on his little brother. "Care for a friendly wager, little brother?" Lambert's chilling gaze landed on Berengar as he wiped the beer residue from his mouth before asking what Berengar was implying. "What kind of wager?" Berengar gulped down the beer in his hand and placed his mug directly next to his first one. "It's simple. We drink. The first man to drop has to run around the courtyard naked at the crack of dawn." Lambert scoffed at Berengar's childish behavior, but he knew his brother was not much of a drinker, which would make this a good chance to embarrass him. Thus Lambert foolishly accepted the terms of the gamble and began to compete with his brother in the game of drink. The old Berengar may not have been much of a drinker, but as a soldier in his past life, who was often stuck in the barracks with nothing to do, Berengar had become quite the experienced drinker. He had no doubt he would outlast Lambert, though whether he won or lost really did not matter to him. Berengar's primary goal was to get Lambert so wasted he would have no recollection of the night before. In the worst-case scenario, Berengar would have to strip down and run around the castle courtyard at dawn. What was the old saying? He who dares wins. As such, the brothers began to drink beer like there was no tomorrow, which did not go unnoticed by the other party-goers who began to cheer them on. As the two engorged themselves on alcohol, Berengar had a calm expression on his face. He was a veteran drinker who could have over a dozen beers and still be able to function properly the next day. Lambert, on the other hand, was far more of a lightweight than he expected. By the time Lambert had reached his 6th beer, he was practically slurring his words. Berengar could not prevent his lips from curling up into a sneer when he saw the sight, which only acted as instigation for Lambert to drink more. By the time they reached 15 beers, Lambert was on the verge of passing out, and Berengar's cognitive faculties were mostly intact. Seeing the state Lambert was in, Lind finally urged the 2 boys to stop their contest. "Let's call it a draw, shall we, boys? It's getting late." Lambert was thoroughly hammered at this point and could barely form a sentence. "Das, right, draw?" Berengar chuckled lightly before he accepted the terms. "Fine, we will call it a draw. Get some rest, little brother." With that, he stood up from his chair and left with Adela towards the castle. He trusted Lind to take care of the rest. Lind, of course, instantly helped up her drunk fiancé and dragged him off to his room, where he quickly passed out. By the time he woke up, he would have a horrible hangover and a complete and total lack of memory of what happened the night before. He would also be facing a serious crisis, as Lind had done exactly as Berengar asked and made it seem like the 2 of them slept together, when in reality, nothing happened between the couple. As for the rest of the nobles who enjoyed the celebration to the fullest, this would be a night they would remember for the rest of their lives. One in which they could not thank Berengar enough for providing. After this night 2 traditions were born in the Duchy of Austria, throwing lavish parties to celebrate one's engagement and ballroom dancing. Chapter 36: A difficult negotiation. Days had passed, and all of the guests who were present for Berengar's ceremony had departed. All except for Count Lothar, who was in the middle of a fierce debate with Siegfried about Lambert's supposed affair with Lind. Strictly speaking, they were not supposed to engage in such behavior before their wedding night, and Lind purposely made it seem like she was pressured into the occasion by a drunken and belligerent Lambert. Though nothing actually happened between the 2, the only people aware of that fact were Berengar and Lind, who used this opportunity to sow division between Lambert and his greatest backer. As far as both families were concerned, Lambert had done the deed with Lind during Berengar's engagement ceremony, and it would not be long before Lind revealed she was pregnant to the 2 families. However, there was still some time between now and then. Berengar sat in the great hall and listened to the bickering of the 2 old men as he dined on schnitzel, which the cooks had prepared for him. He washed it down with a flagon of beer and enjoyed the scene of Lambert being scolded by the 2 feudal lords who were furious with his behavior. Lind had done more than Berengar had asked and made it seem like Lambert had practically forced himself on the poor girl. Of course, Lambert had no memories of the time he spent with Lind and deeply regretted it. If he really did as she claimed, then the worst part of it was that he could not remember what her naked body looked like or how it felt. She had covered herself thoroughly with the sheets when he awoke to the scene and could not get a good glimpse of her bare figure. Lind was standing next to her father with a downcast expression. She was an excellent actor and could play the victim's part quite well. Lothar was spouting his demands to Sigurd as he pointed his finger at him menacingly. Unacceptable. I will not stand for this. I demand some form of compensation for my daughter's chastity, which your errant son violated. Just because they are betrothed does not mean he can force himself on my daughter as he pleases. Sigurd was trying to manage the situation and felt deeply embarrassed by Lambert's actions. Though he knew the boy's relationship with his fiancée was tense, he had no idea that his prized son would act in such a way after having a few beers. I promise, I will do my best to make this right, but what is it exactly you are asking from me? Lothar was genuinely not too appalled by Lambert's behavior. In fact, it was doing him a great favor. This gave him cause to demand a portion of Kufstein's iron reserves, which he immediately requested. I demand 25% of Kufstein's iron reserves in return for your son's actions. Sigurd was outraged by such a demand that was giving away a massive pile of wealth, especially now that Berengar had managed to find a way to turn all of that iron into steel in an efficient manner. As such, he pounded his fist on the armrest of his seat of power and refused Lothar's demands. Absolutely not. You are trying to rob me. Count Lothar frowned at the insinuation and retorted properly. Rob you? A lowly baron like you may not be aware of this, but Linda's chastity has an extreme degree of political significance attached to it as a count's daughter. If your barony were not so rich in minerals, I would have married her off to a duke. At this point, Berengar had put down his fork and got off his chair while tidying his mouth with his napkin. Afterward, he walked over to the center of the great hall, where the two noblemen were bickering. As the man tasked by his father with leading the industrial sector, he had a great deal of say on how its resources were managed. There was not a single possibility that Berengar would allow Lothar to have his way. Pardon me, my lord, but I don't believe that such a request is even remotely reasonable. At most, I would be willing to sell you a supply of steel at a discounted price. I will not under any circumstances hand over the resources of my industrial district because of the improper actions of my little brother. Lothar was thoroughly outraged by this interruption and the offer. Who did this kid think he was to so boldly interrupt a conversation between two lords? Under whose authority do you gain the power to negotiate with a man of my standing? I'm busy talking to your father, little boy. You'd best go back to eating your meal. Berengar chuckled at the vicious response he was given by Count Lothar, who was in all technicality his liege. I'm afraid to say that my father has delegated all responsibility of the mines and steel industry of the region into my hands. If you want to demand compensation in the form of minerals, I'm the one you need to be discussing this with. Lothar glared menacingly at Berengar. If this were true, he would have a much more difficult time getting what he desired from the von Kufstein family. Sigurd was mostly compliant and was not nearly as cunning as Berengar. Over the past few days, Lothar had observed Berengar and his dealings with the other nobles and discovered that he was an incredibly shrewd young man. Berengar would not crumble under pressure Lothar held as count and would fight tooth and nail to make sure every aspect of the deal was favorable to his position. Lothar walked over to Berengar and stared the young man down, a challenge from which Berengar did not back down. Rather, he returned Lothar's vicious gaze with a smug smile, as if no matter what Count Lothar did or said, the negotiations would ultimately be in his favor. This haughty expression further enraged Lothar to the point where he wanted to backhand the arrogant youth. I demand 25%. I will not leave here until I get it. Berengar had struggled to contain his laughter. Aggressive negotiations like this would never work on a man like himself. For it to do so, Berengar would have to fear the power in the hands of Count Lothar, and considering that fact that the young lord could bring forth the power of nearly 1,000 guns and unleash it upon the count's feudal army, he did not fear, nor respect the meager power in which the proud count held. As such, he calmly denied Lothar's demands. Then make yourself comfortable because it looks like you're going to be here for the rest of your life. Do you understand the value of a quarter of our iron reserves when converted into steel? Lothar wanted to throttle the boy for his arrogance. How dare he speak to his liege in such a condescending manner? He would have to teach this boy a valuable lesson. Bah! And I suppose you have the ability to convert such a large amount of iron ore into steel? Do not jest with me, boy. It would take a lifetime to make that much steel. Berengar did not say anything, he just stood there with a satisfied smile on his face. If the Count knew how much steel he was currently in possession of and how much he could produce in one batch, then the man would surely never have suggested such an absurdly high number. Eventually, Berengar broke the awkward silence between the two as he countered the Count's proposal. Here's what I can do. As an official apology from the von Kufstein family for my foolish little brother's unsightly behavior, I will cut the cost of steel sold to your family for the next 10 years by 15%. That is the best I can offer you. Any more than that, and I will be operating at a loss. The brow on Lothar's forehead began to twitch uncontrollably as he struggled to contain his anger. Operating at a loss? Your brother has stolen my daughter's chastity, and you're concerned about operating at a loss? Berengar did not say anything, he just smiled and nodded his head. Truthfully, he had not calculated the demands that Lothar would make into his scheme. He figured that his father would pay Lothar a small amount of gold and silver in compensation, which would be the end of it. However, Lothar had made a ridiculous demand that allowed Berengar to take control of the conversation. He now fully intended to make a profit off of framing his little brother. Lothar approached Berengar very closely and whispered to him in a voice that only the two of them could hear. Do you think your pathetic little barony could withstand the might of the County of Tyrol if I were to order my bannermen to march upon your house? Though Lothar had boldly threatened Berengar in an attempt to get the young lad to back down, he did not get the result he expected. Instead, Berengar smiled devilishly as he whispered back to the old count. My lord, do you think it is wise to send your men to die in Kufstein when your forces will be needed elsewhere soon enough? The count stood stupefied upon hearing those words. Either this young man was referring to his plots to overthrow the Duke, or he was referring to the upcoming civil war that everyone with half a brain knew was on the horizon. Either way, he was absolutely right. He could not afford to send the armies beneath his control into Kufstein to punish them over such a small matter. His bluff had been called, and now the old count had to admit defeat. With great reluctance, he whispered back towards Berengar. I accept your terms on the condition that the price of steel purchased from your lands is reduced by 20%. Berengar's smile was so wide that it had practically taken up the entire lower half of his face at this point. Just now, he had been victorious with the negotiation. All that remained was to see how much of a profit margin he could scrape together from this deal. 17% and I will cover transportation, take it or leave it, that is my final offer. Everyone else was looking at the two who were so close that their faces were practically touching. On the face of Count Lothar was a large scowl. He felt awful not getting what he wanted, but at least he was getting a better deal with Berengar than he was from Ulrich, and better yet it would be steel ingots, not iron ore, that would be shipped to him. Though his daughter's chastity had been violated ahead of her wedding, at the very least, he could gain something from the occasion. After all, he still needed Lambert to succeed Berengar if he was eventually going to get the resources he needed. If anything, this harsh negotiation served as a reminder that Berengar needed to die if the Count's ambitions were to become a reality. Little did the Count of Tyrol know that this whole scenario was a ploy from Berengar to pin Linda's pregnancy on Lambert. If Lothar were aware that not only was his daughter's chastity taken by Berengar long ago but that she was also pregnant with the scoundrel's bastard child, then he would have had the urge to draw his sword at that moment and drive it through Berengar's black heart. But he did not know, and as such, he pretended to be nice to Berengar as he accepted the young lord's offer. Deal. Afterward, Lothar turned away from Berengar and put on an act. You drive a hard bargain, Berengar von Kufstein. Out of the respect that I have for your family, I will agree to your terms. Come, Lind. It is about time you return home. Berengar nearly laughed at the old man's poor performance. However, he instantly became aggrieved when he heard the last part of his sentence. There was no way he was going to allow this old bastard to seize his lover from him. However, before he could protest, Lind stood up to her father. I'm not going. Lothar stopped in his tracks as he turned around and glared at his errant daughter. What did you just say? Lind was no longer afraid of her father's fury. Now that she had Berengar protecting her, she knew there was nothing her father could do. However, she was also quick-witted and came up with a proper excuse to stay behind and spend her days with the father of her child. You need to have proper representation in whatever deal you just came to an agreement with Berengar. I will stay behind and protect your interests. Count Lothar was initially furious that his daughter wanted to stay behind after everything that had transpired, and also downright confused. However, it turned out that she was looking out for the family's interests like she always had. Her explanation made perfect sense, and the more he thought about it, the more he did not trust Berengar. Somehow, that blackguard would screw him over, he could feel it in his bones. With Lind keeping a close eye on the boy, he had nothing to worry about. After all, she was clever enough to keep up with Berengar. Under those circumstances, I will allow you to stay. I will see you at your wedding. Lind smiled and bowed to her father like a proper young lady. Of course, father, I will see you then. Afterward, the count departed from Kufstein, and thus the last guest on Berengar's list of invitations had left his family's regions. From now on, Berengar no longer had to entertain the nobility and could get back to his normal schedule. He had many things to take care of in the coming days, and he was just happy to have a bit of reprieve. Chapter 37. We will see about that. After Lothar had departed from Kufstein, Berengar explained to his family the deal he had reached with the old count. They were very pleased with the results, especially Sigurd, who was convinced that Berengar was fit to be his regent after such a performance. A storm was brewing in the capital of the Kingdom of Germany, and Sigurd feared it would not be long before the war had ravaged the lands. Soon enough, he would be called off to battle once more, and when that happened, he would need a capable leader to rule in his stead. Initially, he was planning on placing one of his counselors as regent. However, these past few months, Berengar had transformed into a formidable young lord, one in which he knew would one day make a superior baron to himself. It was such a pity that he could only allow his son to inherit this humble barony. Berengar's potential as a ruler was so much greater than anyone he had ever met. As such, Baron Sigurd von Kufstein had finalized the plans to declare his son the regent of Kufstein. If for whatever reason he was forced to leave the dominion of his ancestors, it would be his son and heir who would have control while he was away. Tomorrow, he would fully declare to the family and his counselors that Berengar was to be regent. For now, the Baron had to chastise his second son for making such a terrible mistake that, if not for Berengar's intervention, would have cost the family dearly. Lately, Lambert had been failing Sigurd's high expectations. If you were to ask him half a year ago which was his favorite son, it would be Lambert. Yet now Berengar was the shining star of the family, and Lambert was an utter disappointment. The roles of his two sons had reversed completely. While Sigurd had a long and difficult conversation with Lambert, Berengar was currently overseeing the drills of his militia, alongside his second-in-command, Eckhard. Currently, his troops were equipped in entirely new garb. Berengar had used his textile factories and the imported materials to construct the uniforms of his militia. He had gained quite the eye for fashion ever since he was transmigrated into this world and was surrounded by luxuries. As such, the attire of his peasant militia was that of the Landsknecht, which were elite mercenaries of the 16th century battlefields from Berengar's previous life. Their clothing was honestly quite flamboyant, but it looked fantastic from Berengar's perspective. The Landsknecht uniforms were all dyed in the colors of his house, which were black and white and gold. The NCOs and officers were currently garbed in blackened steel munitions-grade half-plate armor, with matching burgonets and gorgets. Each piece had an intricate brass pattern engraved across the armor. Berengar was also properly equipped in the attire, though his outfit was even more garish than the other soldiers. He wore a Waffenrock, which was essentially a skirt that went over his pantaloons, and instead of a burgonet, he was equipped with a blackened steel skullcap, with a feathered Landsknecht hat that was dyed in the colors of his uniform and house. Unlike his officers, the trim of his armor was done with gold, showing off the wealth and prestige he had recently acquired, as well as his authority as the commander. He also wore a chain mail mantle over his gorget, which was made of blackened steel rings, except for the bottom two rows which were made of brass. All of the men were equipped with the anachronistic-looking 1417 land pattern muskets, and they had their socket bayonets attached. Roughly 800 men had been split into 6 companies who were currently training in line tactics. For some time now, Berengar had been attempting to get his father to approve the manufacture of armor for his troops. Initially, his father was adamant that all armor production be given priority to his standing army. However, the workforce of the arms industry in Kufstein was now much larger than it was before, and the exact equipment Sigurd requested for his army was fully fielded. Thus Berengar had finally gotten the approval he needed to equip his militia with the armor they desperately required, but that was a very recent event. Aside from the NCOs and officers, very few men were currently equipped with proper armor. Still, it would not be long before his army was the most well-equipped force in the world. Truth be told, Sigurd was not exactly keen on adapting Berengar's military innovations, primarily because Berengar deliberately downplayed how revolutionary they were, but also because he was quite the traditionalist and believed the use of brigandine, mail, and gambeson for his standing army was a far superior quality than the munitions-grade half-plate and outlandish clothing that Berengar's forces were currently equipped with. He would be absolutely incorrect, as the armor Berengar's troops were fielded with was more than enough to sufficiently protect them against any lethal threat on the current battlefields while still being lightweight and maneuverable enough to conduct warfare properly. In fact, due to the quality of the steel Berengar was currently producing, he could manufacture slightly thinner and lighter weight armor than was historically used in the Renaissance while still being just as effective in protection. As Berengar mustered his forces and walked them through everything from marching drills, firing drills, and anti-cavalry drills, Lind watched from afar with a passionate gaze in her eyes. She was either smart enough or infatuated enough to believe that Berengar's tactics were revolutionary. After all, she had directly heard from Berengar's mouth during pillow talk how effective his weapons and tactics were at the Battle of Mining Town. She was too enamored by the spectacular sight of Berengar commanding his troops to notice that Adela had been walking by and noticed her impassioned ogling of Berengar. Adela instantly felt something was amiss about Linda's glances and began to wonder if Lind had feelings for Berengar. After all, the girl treated her own fiancé like crap, especially after the recent incident, and had always been giving weird looks to Berengar and herself throughout the past couple of months. Initially, she thought that Lind was on Lambert's side in whatever conflict the brothers were engaged in, but now she did not know what to think. These were not the glances of a woman studying her enemy but that of a schoolgirl intensely focused on her crush. As such, Adela decided to approach and question the girl who was slightly older but much more developed than herself while she was currently entranced. Magnificent, isn't he? So much better than his scoundrel of a little brother. Lind was caught up in the scene in the field below and did not even register the fact that Adela had approached her. She merely heard the words and responded on instinct. He sure is. Only after Lind had said those words did she recognize that Adela asked the question and that the little girl was testing her. A look of horror spread across the beauty's face as she realized that she practically just admitted that she preferred Berengar over her own fiancé to Berengar's fiancé. On the other hand, Adela was not pleased. She got the answer she was most afraid of. A frown spread across the cute little girl's face as she quickly became strict with the teenage temptress standing next to her. I do not care if you admire him from afar. I suppose most girls do but do not approach him. Berengar is my future husband, and I have no intention of letting a harlot like yourself steal him away from me. However, the little girl's attempt to get Lind to withdraw backfired completely. The corners of Linda's lips curved into a devilish smile. She slowly approached Adela with a smug expression on her face and whispered in the girl's ear. We will see about that. Afterward, Lind strutted away confidently as she left little Adela pouting in anger like a small child. Though Lind respected Berengar's wishes to not inform others of their relationship, she knew that someday Berengar would recognize their child as his own, and when that day came, if the heavens blessed her with a son, it would be her child and not Adela's who inherited the empire that Berengar would one day carve out of this land. As such, she was feeling pretty confident in the brief but heated exchange between herself and her lover's fiancé. Of course, the moment Berengar found out about this lover's quarrel, she would be punished severely, which also gave her a sense of excitement and anticipation. It had been a while since Berengar had been rough with her. Maybe she could finally invoke his ire with this incident. Adela, on the other hand, was in an extremely foul mood. Linda's response could only mean one thing, that seductress was going to try to steal her man. Adela would not let Berengar fall into the vixen's trap. After all, though he was a benevolent man, he was still a man and could easily fall for a woman's wiles. Especially one as gorgeous as Lind. She vowed in her heart never to allow that to happen. Of course, if she were aware that Berengar had long since been involved in an intimate relationship with Lind, she would probably tear her own heart out. As the thunderous sounds of shots were fired into the straw targets by Berengar and his forces, war was declared in his own backyard without him even being aware. This was not a war that would exist between men and their armies, but two young beautiful women and their claims on a particularly excellent young man. It was only after the militia was done with its daily training that Berengar returned to the village. He was standing alongside his troops in the town square. He had his family's cooks work all day to prepare a feast for his soldiers and himself. While the army was mustering in the fields, the chefs were preparing a banquet for the hard-working troops. When Berengar told his chefs that he wanted to prepare a surprise party for his troops who had fought side by side with him at Mining Town, they were more than eager to help pay respects to the many men who had saved their lord's life. As such, the best dishes they could make were piled into the town square, where the soldiers engorged themselves with food and drank from the endless amount of beer that was poured for them by many young women. After a while of drinking and feasting, Berengar tapped on his mug with a spoon, gaining the attention of his soldiers, who all looked upon him with respect. While still in his armor and just with the helm and cap removed, Berengar stood up from his table and began to give a toast to his men. I told you all I would celebrate our magnificent victory over the traitors at Mining Town. Unfortunately, my damned noble obligations came up, and I was unable to celebrate with you men properly. Though it has been over a month since we stood side by side on the front lines, I wanted to dedicate this night to you all, the brave men of Kufstein who answered their commander's call in a time of need and brought down an army of traitors. Cheers! The town square echoed in cheers as the men celebrated their victory on this fine night. All of which were still in uniform, when the standing army and town guard gazed upon the hundreds of men in the town square in uniform. They began to feel a bit envious, and those who were a part of Lambert's faction began to feel fearful. Though they initially thought this peasant militia was nothing but common rabble formed on a young lord's whim, they had actually managed to win a battle with 0 casualties, which was beyond impressive. As such, Berengar spent the night drinking with his brothers in arms. It was not until 2 a.m. when Berengar returned to his bedchamber, where he found Lind waiting patiently naked on his bed. Berengar approached his lover and began to caress her body. The last words he remembered hearing that night came from Lind as she whispered in his ear seductively and with a devilish grin on her face. "Master, I've been a naughty girl and need to be punished." Though he had no way of knowing what she was referring to, he was too drunk to care. Thus he accepted his role and bound the girl with ropes as he began to punish her for whatever misdeed she was informing him about. It would not be until the next day that he fully became aware of what Lind had said to Adela and the feud it had started. By then, it was already too late to prevent the girls from fighting with one another for his affection, and he would have to endure the consequences of having 2 women by his side. Luckily, neither of the girls were wicked enough to try to take one another's lives. Chapter 38 A Formal Declaration. Berengar awoke next to the arms of his beautiful lover and with a splitting headache. He had drunk far too much with the boys the night before, but it was a victory celebration, and thus he felt his actions were justified. As such, he rose from the bed and decided to take things easy today. A day off from extensive exercise would not hurt him in the slightest, though he would never allow such an activity to become a regular occurrence. Lind awoke shortly after him and placed her arms around his body as she nibbled on his neck, giving the young man a love bite. It was her way of marking her territory and warding off potential predators of her man. In other words, it was a gift for Adela. Berengar laughed at how possessive the girl was this morning and shrugged it off as nonsense. He eventually pushed her down on the bed, thoroughly excited by her actions. He returned the favor and gave Lind a hickey on her graceful and slender neck. As long as she covered it up properly, it would not be a concern. The two engaged in some physical intimacy before parting ways for the morning. Now that Lind had a proper excuse to visit Berengar in the day, she would no longer need to avoid him openly. As long as she approached him under the guise of managing her father's transaction, she could spend time by his side at any point in the day instead of just secretly during the night. Finally, she would have more time with the father of her child. Something she desperately wanted to rub in Adela's face. Though she knew there was a limit as to the degree to which she could flaunt her relationship with Berengar to the little girl, else others might become too suspicious. She had already declared war on Adela and would not back down. Lind knew the little girl was too proud to release the details about their little dispute to the world. As such, she felt confident that she could contain any information regarding this love triangle between the 3 of them. Berengar, on the other hand, was blissfully unaware of the conflict brewing between his future wife and his lover. Thus he was dumbfounded by the malevolent gazes the two girls gave each other at the breakfast table. He began to think that something may have happened between the young ladies that may have soured their relationship, and he was not the only one to come to this conclusion. Lambert witnessed their intense rivalry as they gracefully consumed their breakfast, sitting across from one another with fierce gazes. Of course, Lambert did not really care for the reason, as he was sure it was just the trivial matters of women and did not concern himself in the slightest. As the two girls feud over Berengar without anyone else's knowledge, Sigurd decided to break the awkward silence. I am formally requesting the presence of my family and counselors in the Great Hall after we finish dining. There is an important announcement I would like to make that regards the safety and prosperity of our family and our realm. After saying that, everyone's attention was shifted to the Baron as he spoke in an authoritative voice. Noticing the presence of his future daughters-in-law, he decided to address them personally. My ladies, your presence is not required, but if you would like to attend it, you are more than welcome to. Berengar sighed in relief when he noticed the two women nod at one another with stern expressions. He did not know why the girls were fighting, but he was certain he would find out soon enough. At least for now, the tension was released. Lambert, on the other, appeared visually nervous. If his father was making a formal declaration, it must be something important. He began to fear that the favor his father had shown him was beginning to wane and instead be shifted upon his older brother and rival. Whatever this announcement was about, it surely pertained to Berengar's recent rise in power, which was not good news for him. Berengar sat in silence and continued his meal. Now that his women were not fighting one another, he felt much more at ease and could finally enjoy his breakfast. However, internally he was quite excited. There was only one thing that he could think of that Sigurd would announce after they finished eating, and if it pertained to his thoughts, then it would be great news for the young lord's aspirations. Shortly after the meal was completed, the family gathered in the Great Hall. Lind and Adela were still obviously feuding with each other about something. However, their attention was currently drawn to Sigurd, who sat on his seat of power, where his counselors flanked him. They were men of great importance who advised the Baron on matters about the realm, even they were not privy to the contents of Sigurd's announcement. After everyone had arrived, Sigurd cleared his voice and spoke in a stern tone. I, Sigurd von Kufstein, first of my name, Baron of Kufstein, hereby declare my firstborn son, and heir regent. If I must travel from these lands, he is given full authority derived from me to act as Baron in my stead. A wide smile appeared on Berengar's face as he heard the news. He had been waiting for this declaration for a long time, and he had finally proven himself in the eyes of his father as a capable leader. Lambert, of course, was horrified. This was terrible news for him and his allies. When war finally broke out and Berengar took up his position as regent, he would have the full judicial authority to launch an investigation into Lambert's attempts on his life and gather the evidence he needed to execute him. This meant only one thing. Lambert had at most a year to end his brother's life before the old king croaked, and he was placed into an exceptionally vulnerable position. The problem was Berengar had solidified his position in the hearts of many of the surrounding nobles, those who were benefiting from his steel monopoly, and the burgeoning textile trade would obviously back Berengar if he requested their aid. It was now more difficult than ever to plot against Berengar. On the other hand, the girls both reacted to the news with satisfied smiles on their faces. This was good news not only for the man they loved but also for themselves, whose positions would become more favorable when Berengar became regent. Although when they realized that they both had the same satisfied expression on their faces, they immediately shifted back to a feuding state. The reactions of the counselors to this monumental announcement were varied. They were all aware of Berengar's recent transformation and his formidable capability of presiding over the realm. Thus, many of the counselors were excited by the news, as they could not think of a better man to take up the position. However, a quarter of the counselors were backers of Lambert's attempt to gain power, and thus they were quite miserable at the announcement. If they allowed Berengar to come to power, it would only mean their removal from office at best and their deaths at the worst. Henrietta and Gisela were both delighted by the news, and Sigurd had a satisfied smile on his face. Though they did not know it, battle lines were immediately drawn when this news was announced, and his two sons would increase the brutality of their war of intrigue. Berengar made sure to keep note of the expressions of the counselors who were either indifferent to the news or outright dismayed. It became immediately apparent that they were either on the fence about the issue or outright supporters of his brother. Thus Berengar figured he would get rid of his brother's most immediate backers before taking out any of the other local nobility who supported him. After all, these noblemen who advised his father held significantly more power than those who would answer his call to arms once every blue moon. Later that night, Berengar would get his spy network to acquire the materials he would need to manufacture a particular poison that was virtually undetectable in this medieval world. The target of his new ploy would be the marshal of his father's forces. The man was clearly the most disturbed by the news and even eyed Lambert for his reaction. Berengar did not doubt within his mind that the marshal was in bed with Lambert. As the commander of his father's forces, he presented the biggest threat to the security of his regency and needed to be removed before Berengar seized power. However, that was a task for later. After the declaration was made, Berengar was congratulated by many people, including his future wife and lover. Even Lambert was shocked when Lind approached Berengar immediately after the announcement and fought with Adela over who would pay their respects first. At this moment, Berengar instantly realized what was going on between his two women, and he knew that Lind had said something to Adela to antagonize her. Now her words from the previous night began to make sense, and internally he was furious. When the two were in the middle of bickering, Berengar raised his hand, and the two immediately became silent. Adela, you are my fiancée. You may tell me what you wish to say first. Lind immediately became flustered as she was denied the right to speak with her lover first. Still, she understood his reasoning and let it slide. Congratulations, Berengar. I know you will do your family proud. The little girl then eyed Lind with displeasure and whispered in Berengar's ear. I need to talk to you about something later. Judging by the look on her cute little face, Berengar was certain that she was unaware of the extent of his relationship with Lind, which was a good thing, but he definitely needed to figure out what had been said between the two. He nodded and smiled at his future wife as he held on to her hands. Thank you. That means a lot coming from my fiancé. While saying that phrase, he eyed Lind with an expression that said, I know what you did, and I'm not happy. Lind immediately flinched when she was the vicious gaze Berengar had given her. She began to think that maybe she should not have openly declared war on Adela so soon. She was definitely going to be punished far worse tonight, which made her dreadfully excited. Of course, she was skilled enough at acting to mask her desire with a look of indifference. After Berengar had accepted Adela's respects, he moved on to Lind, who bowed respectfully and said formally, Lord Berengar, I would like to congratulate you on your latest title. I trust you will be a benevolent and efficient regent in the future. Lambert was extremely agitated by the sight of his fiancée paying respects to her older brother, but judging by the lack of informality in her tone, it was merely her fulfilling her social obligations. As such, he never suspected she was romantically involved with Berengar. Instead, he felt even more sure of his previous thoughts that she was bickering with Adela over something frivolous and thus did not pay any more attention to her actions. It went on for some time, but he had to entertain many people paying respects to him. When he was finally done with his noble obligations, he thanked his father for the trust he had placed with him and left the great hall. Adela was in tail following her fiancé. When they were finally secluded, he could not prevent himself from asking the little girl what exactly was the nature of her grievance with Lind. So, are you going to tell me what happened? Adela tried to fake ignorance, as she did not want to discuss her war with the temptress for his affection. I am sure I do not know what you are talking about. Berengar laughed at the young girl's cute face as she tried to pretend like she did not understand his question. Come on. It is obvious that you are fighting with my brother's fiancé. Even my father noticed it, and he isn't exactly the sharpest tool in the shed when it comes social circumstances. Adela let out a deep sigh and told Berengar the truth of her encounter with Lind and how she felt about it. Needless to say, she was not happy. Berengar was an excellent actor and laughed it off as if it was a joke. He really needed to salvage the situation, and he did his best to do so. That's it? She's obviously angry with Lambert for his drunken antics and is trying to make him angry by pursuing his older brother. If she really has any intentions to steal me away from you, I'm afraid it's too little too late. You have nothing to worry about. Adela looked at Berengar with a sheepish expression as she asked him with tears forming in her eyes. Really? Berengar, of course, instantly felt intense guilt for lying to his fiancée about the true nature of his relationship with Lind, but he could not well afford to reveal it at the moment. Granted, He felt justified in his actions and did not feel the slightest guilt for the act of having a lover on the side. However, he did not let any of those complex emotions show on his face, as he masked his emotions with a very convincing facade. Of course. Do you think I would throw you a lavish engagement ceremony like I did if I did not have the intention to marry you? His words made sense, and Adela slowly wiped the tears from her eyes. A smile spread across her face before she reached around Berengar's neck and pecked him on the cheek. Afterward, she ran away in embarrassment. Though she had kissed his cheek many times, it was still too much for the little girl to face him afterward. Berengar told the truth when he said that last part. He had no intention to marry Lind. He had developed her into the perfect mistress, but that did not mean that she was wife material by any means. That was not something that could be cultivated in a woman past a certain age. By the time she was physically mature, she was either a wife material or she was not, or so Berengar believed. The young lord had personally witnessed too many men's lives ruined in his past life by the full-grown women they tried to change into housewives and the court system which favored the women after they no longer wanted to be married, no matter what atrocious things they may have done during their time of marriage. Luckily for him, divorce was a rare occurrence in medieval times. She would essentially need the Pope's approval. Even then, it would require special circumstances. While adultery was grounds for the dissolution of a marriage, it was a costly process and rarely worked in a woman's favor. He figured sooner or later he could convince Adela to share him with Lind. The girl was stubborn and prideful but not entirely closed-minded. Of course, he would first need to marry the girl and show her how much he cared for her before even broaching the subject of his lover at the very least. It would be many years before he ever admitted to it, and he would do his damnedest to make sure she did not find out until then. Thinking about it now, he should probably do his best to get in the good graces of the church. Despite being an atheist, he realized how much power the papacy held in this new world. It was far greater than the timeline of his past life. He decided to speak to his priest at the upcoming Sunday Mass and build a relationship with the clergy. It would be nice if he could find an open-minded priest, but the likelihood of that happening was very slim. Whatever the case, he would never confess his sins to a member of the clergy, especially in an era where the papacy held significant authority. Before going to bed, Berengar sent a message to his spy network to acquire the means to produce white arsenic, a tasteless, odorless, and lethal poison that could be used in a powdered form. When he could properly manufacture this deadly poison, he would use it on his first target. Though it would take some time to acquire the means to create it, thus he could only wait until his first assassination attempt. Before long, Lind showed up in his room with a guilty expression on her face. She willingly submitted herself for discipline, and Berengar spent the rest of his waking hours punishing the young beauty severely for instigating conflict with Adela. Which she, of course, enjoyed to her heart's content. Though at the moment he had assured Adela he would not pursue Lind, she would only be suspicious from here on out. Nevertheless, Lind had actually been the one to form the love triangle that would one day become the backbone of a great dynasty. Chapter 39 Religious Ambitions. A few days passed, and it was now Sunday. The day in which the people of Kufstein, both high and low, would gather for Mass, or liturgy as it was known in this era. Currently, Adela stood outside Berengar's door with little hope in her heart as she prepared to knock upon it and ask Berengar the same question she had inquired about ever since she first arrived in Kufstein. Unlike Berengar, who was secretly an atheist, Adela was a true believer in the gospel and held the church in high regard. However, every time she approached her fiancé to attend the Sunday service together, he always had an excuse as to why he could not go. Thus she was beginning to fear that he was, in fact, a heathen or an apostate, which was a condition she could not accept. Today she had fierce determination to drag the man she loved to church and save his potentially damned soul. As such, she sighed heavily before knocking heavily on the door to Berengar's room in which he was currently exercising. "Berengar, will you attend liturgy with me? It has been quite lonesome without your presence." To her surprise, the door swung open, and Berengar had a smile on his face. He completely forgot that he was currently dressed in only his undergarments while his upper body glistened with sweat, the sight of which caused Adela's face to flush with embarrassment. It took him a moment to realize why she was acting in such a sheepish manner before he realized that her eyes were fixated on his developing abs. He quickly put up a single finger and shut the door while saying, "One moment." By the time he returned, The young lord was dressed in a white linen undershirt that clung to his sweaty body. This was slightly better, and as such, Adela regained her composure before asking the question on her mind for a second time. Berengar, will you attend the Sunday service with me? She had no intention of letting him play hooky now that he had opened the door. However, what truly shocked her was Berengar's immediate acceptance of his request. Of course. Today I am quite free, and I would love to attend the liturgy with you. This was quite shocking to her. Since she arrived, he had never once accepted her request to go to church together, but now all of a sudden, he agreed as if it were an ordinary thing for him to do. Was he really just swamped with managing his secular activities this entire time? She only felt foolish for doubting the religious views of her betrothed, whom she held in high regard. Berengar sniffed himself before requesting the young girl, who seemed incredibly excited about the fact that he would finally be attending the service with her. Just let me clean myself up a bit, and I will meet you at the castle's gates in a quarter of an hour, okay? Adela quickly agreed to his request before chastising him as if she expected him to run away the moment she left his sight. Don't be late. Berengar nodded and smiled. Shortly thereafter, Adela departed, and Berengar's dropped his facade. Before muttering under his breath, I suppose she's lucky I have plans for the church. Afterward, he grabbed a hold of his attire and headed to the bath, as promised. He would arrive at the castle's gates fully clothed in fashionable attire within a 15-minute time frame. All the while, Adela had been waiting for him at the entrance with a bright smile on her face. Berengar quickly grabbed a hold of the little girl's hand and led her to the church within the village where the rest of his family was already gathered. By the time he arrived, he had noticed that Lambert was there alongside Lind, and Henrietta was grouped up with their parents. Lind had a shocked expression as she saw Berengar attend church for the first time since she had arrived. She was not particularly religious, but she at least pretended like she was. Berengar was usually silent about the topic and avoided the church as if it had been the epicenter of a plague. Still, the heavenly beauty felt quite perturbed as she saw her lover attending church alongside his fiancée. After greeting his family and lover, Berengar walked into the chapel with Adela before standing at attention while the priest went over his sermon. There were not many pews in medieval times, and as such, unless one was old or feeble, they usually stood in the center throughout the entire service. As Berengar gazed upon the luxurious trappings of the chapel he found himself in, he could not help but scoff at the sight. Evidently, the church here was quite wealthy, yet he never saw them out in the field aiding the villagers in any charitable way. He would not doubt it if the head priest himself was embezzling funds to fill his own pockets. After all, the church was mighty, wealthy, and most importantly, corrupt, especially in this timeline. When he scoffed at the sight of how embellished this single church was, it did not go unnoticed by the deacon, who was a young man currently on the last phase of the path to priesthood. Though the priest himself did not notice Berengar's reaction, the deacon could not help but do so. After the ceremony was over, Berengar had initially intended to speak with the priest. After all, he wanted to establish some ties with the church. In particular, he was looking for an open-minded priest who may become useful in the future. However, before he could, he was approached by the deacon, who was quite cordial in his manners. My lord Berengar, that is your name, correct? I hear many great things from the mouths of the parish about your many deeds. Do you have a minute to talk? Berengar was quite curious why the deacon would approach him. As such, he took the time out of his busy schedule to see what this supposed holy man had to say. Berengar followed the man to a secluded area, where they began to chat. The deacon was a young man, quite possibly even younger than Berengar. The man had short, dirty blonde hair and emerald eyes. He was the third son of a Saxon count and opted to join the church rather than vie with his siblings to inherit his father's land. This decision turned out to be a wise choice, considering most of his 5 brothers met with terrible accidents after the young deacon had left his family behind. As such, he was a man who was not only aware of Berengar's precarious position but was actively supportive of him. In fact, he was currently a member of Berengar's vast spy network throughout his family's lands. Even Berengar did not know the identities of all the little birds who reported to his lover about the activities of his enemies. The young man was eager to greet the Baron's son and heir whom he had already aided with great effort in countering Lambert's schemes. As such, he bowed before Berengar respectfully and said his piece. My lord, I doubt you are aware of who I am, but I am one of the many members of your web of intrigue, and I know why you are here. You seek to establish ties with the church, is that correct? Berengar was shocked that a deacon would belong to his network of agents, and as such, he proceeded with caution. Testing the young deacon with a question only someone directly reporting to his spymaster would know the answer to. I'm afraid Adela has never mentioned you to me. The deacon was a bright man and knew instantly he was being tested by Berengar. If he were fake, he would most likely nod his head and recognize Adela as his spymaster. Yet, that was not the case. Instead, the young man grinned and gave the correct answer. Funny, I remember speaking to a young woman with strawberry blonde hair and sky-blue eyes, not to mention her magnificent bust. Berengar's expression was indifferent, but he was really excited he already had a member of the church working for him in the shadows. As such, he clasped the man's shoulder and apologized for his test. I apologize for my rudeness, it appears you really are a supporter of mine. One can never be too careful these days. What is your name? The man smiled greatly after hearing Berengar apologize for testing him. He truly was a man of character as he had heard. I am Ludolf, a deacon of this church. Berengar walked around the area with Ludolf and picked up a golden chalice. Once more, he decided to test the youthful deacon and see if he could be fit into his plans for the future. Tell me, Ludolf, what are your thoughts of the garish embellishment we see around us? Gold crosses, chalices, chandeliers, and even rosaries. Is this not a waste of the church's funds? Ludolf smiled once more upon hearing Berengar's views of the church's wasteful spending. I could not agree more, my lord. Unfortunately, the priest of this chapel and the Bishop of Innsbruck care more about appearances than helping the common folk. Something I have heard that you accomplished quite well in our stead. I'm afraid no matter where I go, that seems to be the current status quo of the church. Sucking money away from the people like leeches with promises of salvation in return for their hard-earned coinage. Using it to build lavish chapels like this one. Such wasteful spending if you were to ask me. Berengar's lips began to curve into a smile. Though this young man may not seem like much, he had the potential to become the Martin Luther of this world. With the right guidance and support he may very well break the papacy's stranglehold over the kingdoms of Europe. Something which Berengar greatly desired. If his aspirations were to become a reality, then he could not have the church wield unrestricted power throughout Europe as it currently did. He would need to start a revolution from within, and it just so happened this young deacon named Ludolf already had some revolutionary ideas. If pushed in the right direction, he could prove to be a powerful ally against the authority of the church. Thus Berengar decided to act like the devil on the young man's shoulder and guide him in causing a major schism within Christianity. Ludolf, I share many of the same sympathies. It is the reason I have not been attending service lately. Would you like to go for a walk? I would very much like to discuss my concerns about the direction the church is heading in. Ludolf, a wide-eyed and faithful young man concerned with the church's misconduct, took this seemingly benevolent young man for his word and followed him on a walk. The two would have an exceptionally long discussion about the difference between secular and spiritual authority and the separation of church and state. By the time the two had finished talking, several hours had passed, and Ludolf felt as if he had been enlightened by Berengar, who acted as if he were a pious man concerned about ecclesiastical corruption and its effects on the people of Europe. Thus Berengar not only further gained support from Ludolf in his war of intrigue against his brother but also in his future struggle against the church and their overreaching power. One thing was certain. This man held great importance for Berengar's plans to bring an end to the era of the church's influence over the secular authority of the German people. After sending Ludolf back to the chapel with much to think about, Berengar returned home, where he dined with his family. Adela was pleased that he went to church with her. Though Lind looked at him strangely, she had many questions about why he went to church and who he spent his afternoon with. Nevertheless, now was not the time for the topic. After sharing a meal with his family, Berengar took a bath and then returned to his quarters, where he further developed the plans for the future city of Kufstein. Shortly thereafter, he heard a knock on his door and opened it to find Lind, who sprung into his arms. Berengar accepted her embrace while kicking the door close. After passionately kissing one another for several moments, Lind broke away and finally asked the father of her child the question on her mind. You don't seem like the type of man to take the gospel seriously? Why did you go to church? Berengar could not help but chuckle as he sat on his bed and poured himself and his lover some wine. After taking a swig from the chalice, he answered the question honestly. I have plans for the church. I'm not going to lie. I seek to destroy its dominion over these lands and its people by any means necessary. Truly I find the hypocrisy, corruption, and power of the church in this world to be appalling. Lind was quite shocked by his ambitions. The church had held significant authority over Europe for centuries, yet the man she loved claimed he wanted to bring that era to a sudden end and implied using force to achieve his goals. Though she was not religious, she understood the church's significant power. It would not be an easy task. You know, if word got out about your plans, the church would declare you a heretic? Berengar nearly choked on his wine as he laughed at Linda's remark. Let them come. I do not rely on the protection of God. Instead, I trust in the thunder of guns and the men who wield them. Soldiers win wars, not faith, and before long, my army will rival the legendary power of the kingdom of heaven. Though he was exaggerating, it was no lie to say that his armies were becoming quite well equipped and trained, better than any other force in the current world. Even if they only acted as a militia at the moment, they would become the core of his power when he inherited this land. Their numbers swelled by the day, and now that he was producing proper armor alongside their arms, Berengar felt as if his army could easily contend with a force 5 times their numbers on the field of battle. After all, his weapons were beyond effective against the greatest units of the era, and with the right tactics, he could overcome any foe. With time his weapons would be even more efficient, and by then, nobody could stop him. Truthfully, religion had its purpose of serving in Berengar's many plans, but a church that refused to bend to his will did not. Berengar would make use of scripture and the concept of divinity in his future efforts of propaganda. Though he personally did not believe in such things, he realized that religion played an important role in functioning society. As such, he had plans for a reformation of the church, the extent of which would rely on Ludolf and those who would support his future efforts. As for Catholicism and the Pope's authority over secular affairs, he would never recognize such a thing. This adamant refusal to bend to the will of the church would lead to many conflicts with the papacy in the near future. Lind did not know what to say after hearing such a speech. Either Berengar was a madman, or he truly had the capability to change the world. Personally, she did not care if the church's power over these lands collapsed and supported the rising ambitions of the man beside her. After finishing their wine, the two stripped off their lavish attire and embraced each other in the dark of night. For the rest of their waking hours, they intimately enjoyed each other's company. Chapter 40. Caught in the act. Berengar gazed upon the musketeer who stood upon the testing field. In his hands was a small spherical steel device with a fuse sticking out from its top. In his other hand was a slow match in which the soldier used to ignite the fuse. After the successful ignition, the man lobed the spherical device towards a safe distance and quickly sought refuge behind the provided cover. Within seconds a thunderous explosion occurred, and shrapnel was sent in every direction, shredding apart the closely packed straw dummies in which it had landed near. After such a shocking scene, the sound of slow clapping could be heard from afar as Berengar showed his sign of approval of the new weapon. What was just tested by this brave man was the prototype of a hand grenade. It would not be long before he could field these to his troops in large numbers and establish grenadier into his ranks. However, this revolutionary weapon of war was not the most exciting innovation being tested to this day. Eckhard was filled with anticipation as the artillery crew loaded a strange-looking device into the bore of the 1417 pattern 12-pounds cannon. The old knight prayed to the Father above in heaven that this device went off without a hitch. After a relatively smooth loading of the cannon, the powder was vented, and the cannoneer used the linstock to light the fuse. After a few moments, the familiar roar of the 12-pounds cannon echoed into the air. However, what truly astonished those who were fortunate enough to watch this secret testing, was that when the projectile landed it exploded upon impact into many fragments, sending shards of steel into all directions. The result of which was far more destructive than the hand grenade, which was tested previously. This time a thunder of applause rose from the bystanders as they watched a new era of artillery being born before their very eyes. Berengar had a wicked smile on his face. He had finally done it. He had created the first explosive shell. Though the solid ball still had its uses, against infantry, nothing was more devastating than explosive shells. In his previous life's timeline, the explosive shell was not invented until the 16th century. However, The shell he was currently using was modeled after those utilized by the 12-pound Napoleon cannon by Union forces in the American Civil War. It was a far more efficient shell than the earlier designs. Eckhard saluted Berengar and congratulated him on his newest innovation. With this, their militia was even more fearsome than they were a month ago at the Battle of Miningtown. Commander, let me be the first to congratulate you on the success of this truly revolutionary design. With these shells, our artillery will rule the battlefields. Berengar smiled and returned the salute to his second-in-command. However, one thing was noticeably missing from his forces, the third branch that comprised all early modern armies for centuries. Cavalry, though he would not be able to raise cavalry for his militia until after he took over his father's position, either as a regent or as the baron himself. Nevertheless, this was truly a monumental occasion. With shell and canister being fired out of his 12-pound cannons, he could engage forces far larger than his own on the field of battle. As his militia further completed their training and outfitted themselves with better equipment, Berengar believed it would not be long before he could begin his conquest of Germany. It might take a few years for him to succeed his father. In his eyes, the Baron of Kufstein was not likely to survive the upcoming war. By the time the war was over and the various feudal powers of the kingdom exhausted themselves in bloody conflict, he would rise from the ashes and stake his claim with his superior army. By right of conquest, one day, he would be emperor of the German people. After testing the new weapons, Berengar wanted them mass-produced as quickly as possible. As such, he put in priority order. He would have his artillery trained to use the new shells effectively and would establish the strongest and most elite of his infantry forces into grenadier. Of course, all weapons operations were strictly confidential. As such, they would have to use the new testing field Berengar had set up, out of the sight from unwanted eyes. After testing the weapons successfully and giving his new orders, Berengar returned to the castle, which took a while, seeing as he had to travel from his secret testing facility. When he returned, he saw Adela and Henrietta playing in the castle corridors. They were not too far apart in age and were getting along splendidly. On the other hand, Lind had a tense relationship with Henrietta. The little girl had good intuition and had a feeling something was going on between Lambert's fiancé and Berengar. A sense of intuition that the men of the family desperately seemed to lack. As such, the little Loli constantly ran away from Lind whenever she tried to get along with the family. Of course, Linda's most strained relationship was with his Berengar's mother, Gisela. Gisela was a shrewd and proud baroness who had long suspected an affair between Berengar and Lind, practically since the first night when Lind arrived at the castle. However, she saw how Lind treated Lambert and saw this dirty secret as a way to break her second son's betrothal. If Berengar wanted a lover to hold him over until he married Adela, then she would allow his selfishness, so long as she could later use it as a means to get rid of the young vixen once and for all. Though she was not aware of the fullest extent of Linda's abuse towards Lambert, she could tell it was at the very least a verbally abusive and unhealthy relationship. Especially since the night of Berengar and Adela's engagement ceremony and the alleged actions Lambert had engaged in. The growing closeness between Berengar and Lind under the guise of Count Lothar's transaction did not ease the Baroness's animosity toward the young woman. Berengar was aware of how his mother eyed the two of them and had long since known about her suspicions. However, as long as his mother did not intervene, he would not say anything to her about his relationship with his lover. Of course, if Gisela were aware that Lind was currently pregnant with Berengar's child, she would do everything in her power to separate the two of them. When Adela saw that Berengar had returned home, she ran over and hugged him. Berengar responded to this by petting her head gently. It was nice having two women with completely different personalities to care for him. He vowed that he would never give up this lifestyle and never complicate it further by adding more women to the mix. He cared for both of his women equally, as they both served their own unique roles in his life. After a while, Adela let go of Berengar and asked him the question on her mind. "Are you done with work for the day?" Berengar smiled and nodded at his little fiancée before noticing Henrietta come over to him with a sheepish expression. "Big brother, will you play with us?" Berengar chuckled lightly as the little Loli grabbed a hold of his torso and hugged the other side of him. He thought to himself for a moment and then decided to entertain the two girls, who were currently in the middle of playing an imaginary game. One where Adela was the crown princess, who was captured by an evil witch. Berengar played the role of the valiant knight as he strode through the castle walls and rescued the princess from the wicked grasp of Henrietta, who acted the part of a wicked witch. Berengar felt quite embarrassed playing such childish games at his age and was thankful that video cameras did not exist at this time. He could not imagine what the internet would label him if this scene were posted on some video sharing site from his previous life. However, after rescuing the princess and slaying the evil witch, Berengar picked up Adela in a princess carry and walked around the castle with her. To his surprise, he got a reward that he was not expecting. When Adela gently pecked him on the lips, her face began to become red with embarrassment and she looked away while in his arms and awkwardly muttered, "My hero." At this point, even Berengar felt embarrassed, as he was not mentally prepared for such a thing. He did not know what to say, so he chose some cheesy one-liner and smiled at Adela and said in a serious tone, "I will always protect you, my little princess." The scene was sickening to Lind as she watched in the corner. It was only when Adela's eyes met her own with a furious stare did the young beauty realize that her little rival had been aware of her presence and that Adela had deliberately done this to mark her territory. Lind thought it was cute that the little girl considered that slight peck on the lips to be considered a kiss. Obviously, Lind would have to leave her own mark on Berengar later that night to make up for it. After seeing Lind had watched the entirety of his performance, Berengar's heart immediately imploded. He sincerely hoped nobody was watching what would be considered a potentially illegal activity in his previous life. Yet he was caught in the act by his own lover. He was never going to live this moment down, and he could tell by the smirk on Linda's face that she was going to hold this moment over his head forever. Berengar attempted to defuse the situation and asked Lind an important question, which immediately received the two little girls' glares. "Would you like to join us, Lind?" The heavenly beauty immediately scoffed at the idea and glared at Adela. "No thanks, Berengar, I've long since matured beyond the need to play such childish games. A word of advice, if you keep playing games like this with little girls, people might believe you to be a pervert." And with that said, Lind turned around and walked away with a smug expression on her face. Before Adela or Berengar could even form a response, she had already turned the corner and was out of sight. The couple then stared at each other awkwardly as Adela was still in Berengar's arms. Henrietta, of course, was lying on the floor pretending to have been slain, but she still managed to overhear the conversation, and her disdain for Lind grew even greater as a result. After Linda's departure, there was an awkward silence for a while before Berengar finally let Adela down from his arms. Feeling embarrassed about the whole situation, the young man scratched the back of his head before calling it quits for the evening. "I suppose we should end it here. We can play again some other time." Adela nodded. She was also quite embarrassed after Linda's harsh words. On the other hand, Henrietta was pouting. She wanted to play some more with her big brother and soon-to-be sister-in-law. It was rare where she was able to play games with Berengar these days. Nevertheless, she acquiesced to their conditions. Either way, she would hold her elder brother to his word that they would definitely play together later. Afterward, Berengar dined with his family. It was a civil conversation, and there was less animosity between him and Lambert than usual. Berengar was well aware that Lambert was in the middle of cooking up a conspiracy against him. After all, it had been a while since Berengar was given the title of Regent, and Lambert had yet to act. What Lambert did not know is that Berengar was also in the process of conspiring against his brother. His plan would not only disrupt Lambert's plot but actively take out one of the boy's greatest allies. After dinner, Berengar snuck out into the town where he entered his newly built chemical laboratory today. Tonight he would complete the production of white arsenic, which would allow him to begin his plot to assassinate his father's marshal, who was an ardent supporter of Lambert. Of course, he had to confirm such a thing before acting rashly. While some of his spies were acquiring the materials to create arsenic, others were gathering intel about any potential alliance with Lambert. In the process, Berengar uncovered Lambert's plot to act against Berengar, and frame him and his militia for multiple crimes, and use the marshal as a witness. Unfortunately for the teenage boy, the marshal would soon become very ill and pass away from this world. Berengar began to laugh sadistically as he saw the powdered arsenic that was created overnight. He would give his many spies strict instructions to lace the marshal's wine with the poison in small doses for the next week. Once the man became dreadfully ill, Berengar would increase the dose, effectively ending the man's life. As far as anyone was concerned, the marshal would have fallen ill and passed away from said illness shortly after. Even if someone expected an assassination, nobody would be able to prove it. Just like that, Berengar had taken this war of intrigue to the next level. Lambert would soon enough be left alone, cut off from any support, and when Berengar finally had his scoundrel of a little brother by his lonesome and the authority to pursue justice, then, and only then would he put an end to this war of intrigue once and for all. After distributing the poison to his assassins, Berengar quietly returned to the castle. He made sure that his absence went unnoticed. When he finally returned, he saw the familiar sight of Lind waiting for him. She immediately ran into his arms and kissed him passionately, as if she was trying to remove the mark upon him that Adela had left previously. Just like that, Berengar and Lind spent the remainder of the night enjoying each other's passionate embrace. Chapter 41 Linda's Revelation. A month had passed, and Berengar awoke once more at the crack of dawn. Lying next to him was Lind, who was sprawled about under the sheets. Her silky strawberry blonde hair glistened under the light of the sun. She was still asleep and lately had slept through his morning exercise. She was now roughly 2 months pregnant at this point, and as such, Berengar allowed her some much-needed rest, as he knew that nobody else in the castle would be up at this hour. However, he quickly got out of bed and started his daily workout. Today was a chest-oriented day, so he used his bench press. Though he recognized that he would never be as physically strong as he was in his past life in this life. Berengar still tended to exercise 4 to 5 days a week. After spending half an hour lifting various weights, Berengar quietly exited his room and went for his daily run. He liked to run at least 10 miles a day during the days of the week he exercised. As such, he ran around the village in loose-fitting clothes early in the morning when the farmers began to get to work. Due to the recent industrialization of the region, many of the commoners had proper working hours and were still resting at this time. Thus, the number of people up at this ungodly hour was constantly dwindling. Berengar would wave and say hello to the common folk, but his primary focus was on his run. The only other people who were up at this hour were the militia members in basic training. When their commander ran by, getting in his morning run, they all saluted him at attention. He returned the salute as he continued to run. The fact that the men could see their lord and commander up at the same hour, engaging in an exercise routine like themselves, boosted their morale, as well as their trust in Berengar. He was a man who led by example and refused to get any more sleep than his men did. Berengar also never truly had a day off from his work. He was so busy maintaining his region's industrial, agricultural, and military sectors that he felt like he did more work than his father did. In fact, his father, the Baron, had deliberately pushed an excess of his workload onto Berengar, expecting him to break from the stress. Still, Berengar took it in stride and exceeded his expectations in every way. This was one of the reasons Siegherd gave him the prestigious title of Regent. Berengar thrived when he was busy. He was not a man who could handle idle time well. When Berengar had downtime, he was bored, and he always found something to do when he was bored. Preferably something productive. As such, he worked harder than anyone he knew. This was a trait from his previous life, where he had to work hard for everything he owned. His family was not particularly wealthy growing up. Both of his parents worked full-time jobs with excessive overtime. From a young age, he found himself helping around the house to alleviate the stress on his parents' shoulders. That was one of the reasons he knew all of his family's cooking recipes by heart. As the son of German immigrants, his youth was filled with German cuisine, and when he reached a certain age, he handled the cooking and cleaning of the house when his parents were at work. By the time he was an adult, he had entered Westpoint, and after graduation, was an officer in the military. As such, he spent much of his downtime looking busy. In his mindset, if you are looking busy, you might as well be productive. After finishing his run in roughly an hour and a half, Berengar returned to the castle, where he washed the sweat away from his body in the private bathhouse the family had constructed within their castle. After getting out of his bath, over 2.5 hours had gone by since the time he woke up, and he planned to get some work done in his chambers. He returned to his room to find that Lind was still asleep. By now, the servants were wide awake and active throughout the castle. Even his family members were out and about. The fact that the young woman was still in his room meant there was a great risk involved with returning to her quarters at this point. Berengar walked over to the bed and got inside with Lind. He decided to tease the girl and caress her bare body until she woke up. She immediately felt him grabbing onto her heavenly bust, and a smile spread across her face as she pretended to sleep. However, when Berengar whispered in her ear, "It's already past 7:30. If you continue to sleep in, my family will find you here." Lind immediately got up and out of bed, while shaking his hands away from her breasts. "Master, why didn't you tell me it was so late already?" Berengar chuckled as he watched her get dressed in her nightgown from the night before, with a big grin on his face. "You need your sleep, so I decided to let you rest." After getting dressed in her nightgown, the girl kissed him on the lips before absconding from his room in secrecy, cautiously returning to her own quarters while making sure nobody was aware she had spent the night with Berengar. If Berengar had not awoken her, she would have surely slept in long enough to cause a scandal. Thankfully, her lover was looking out for her. After Lind had left his room, Berengar spent the remainder of his morning going through his progress. By now, the formation of 2nd Artillery Battery was taking precedence over the infantry battalion's ranks. Most of the new recruits were placed into the 2nd Artillery Battery, while the arms factory had begun to spam 12-pound cannons. He now had more cannons than cannoneers, which he supposed was a good problem to have. Due to the increase in workforce, he was able to form the 2nd steel production line in half the time of the 1st, and it was now fully operational. With the increase in productivity of the mines after the von Kufsteins seized them from Ulrich's family, the steel-making factory could double its output. Any steel that exceeded their production capability was sold at a fair price to the contacts he had made during his engagement ceremony. The armor he designed had been produced in massive numbers for his troops, and a total of 1/4 of this his soldiers were now equipped with munitions-grade half-plate armor. After investing in importing materials and establishing the use of inventions like the spinning mule, he was now able to make clothing for peasants and nobility fetching a fair price while relying mostly on local production. It was only the super-luxurious fashion that cost him a pretty penny to make. Luckily, he was still able to sell them for quite the profit, thus expanding the already filled coffers of the Barony of Kufstein. Today was an important day for Berengar. 2 of his schemes would fully come to fruition this day. Over the past month, the Marshal had been slowly poisoned by the young lord's spies to the point that he was very near death. A slight overdose today would rid the world of one of Lambert's most powerful allies. Though physicians had checked on the man, ultimately, they could not find out the cause of what ailed him. The second scheme was far more important in the long run and would come to fruition this day. Lind would be informing the family that she was pregnant with Lambert's child when in all reality, it was Berengar's. Since the night of Berengar and Adela's engagement ceremony, she had avoided Lambert as much as possible. The boy had approached her several times requesting that they sleep together, but she kept refusing him. As such, Berengar arrived on time at the breakfast table, where he waited patiently for Lind to break the news. After the family enjoyed their meal for quite some time in peace, the young woman finally dropped the bombshell on the family. The girl's face instantly grew flustered as she spoke her words. "I have an important announcement to make." After a slight pause which aroused everyone's interest, Lind looked at Berengar, then at Lambert, and then back down to the table where her meal was laid out. Finally, she blurted out what she was instructed to say, minus a very critical detail. "I'm pregnant." From Berengar's perspective, the girl noticeably failed to mention it was Lambert's child. However, that did not stop the family from being shocked by the revelation and assuming it was Lambert's. Though she didn't explicitly say the child was Lambert's, the only person who suspected it might be Berengar's was Gisela, who eyed her eldest son curiously. Though Berengar may try to act surprised, Gisela knew when her son was lying, and at that moment, she was correctly able to guess that the child was, in truth, Berengar's, not Lambert's. Lambert was at first in shock when he heard the news. He had to clarify the issue. "You're pregnant?" Lind nodded in response. Sigurd, on the other hand, interrupted and asked his own question. "It is my son's?" Lind frowned at the comment and answered honestly. Who else would be the father? With that being said, a smile appeared on both Lambert's and Sigurd's faces. They were excited by the news and could not wait to throw a wedding. On the one hand, Lambert was happy because this solidified Lind as his woman. Even if she was not sleeping with him, nobody else was either. As such, he could be considered the only man to sleep with the gorgeous young woman who was considered one of the 3 heavenly beauties of Austria. On the other hand, Sigurd was just happy to have a grandchild, which he would hopefully be able to see before he perished. He, too, did not have high expectations for surviving the upcoming war. The two were completely unaware that the girl never once directly admitted to Lambert being the father. After all, Sieghard had another son. Lambert attempted to hug Lind in response to the news, but the girl slapped him across the face in front of his family and shouted at him. "Who said I had forgiven you?" Quickly the young boy sulked back to his seat in silence. Berengar was trying to contain his wicked grin. He had truly grown into the role of a sadist over the last few months, at least when it regarded his enemies. Nothing gave him more joy than watching his nemesis dangle on the hook he had cast for him. Lambert played along to Berengar's tune perfectly, and the young lord could not get enough of it. He supposed he had Lind to thank for this juicy scene. By not directly admitted to Lambert being the father, Lind was essentially leaving a door open for Berengar to claim the child as his own later in life. Something in which the young woman was adamant about making a reality. Thus it was Linda's scheme and not Berengar's which was cemented in history this day. Adela, on the other hand, had never suspected Berengar to be the father. Despite the fact that Lind had openly declared war on the young girl and had by vying for Berengar's affections as of late. She had enough faith in her betrothed that he would not do such a thing behind her back. Also, she was aware of Lambert's supposed misdeed, and the timing for Linda's pregnancy matched perfectly. In a million years, the little girl would never suspect that Berengar had deliberately framed Lambert to assume the role of the father of his bastard child. As such, a smile spread widely across her face as she felt as if by this news she had already won the war against Lind. After all, there was no way Berengar would be interested in a woman who was pregnant with his brother's child. The conversation around the breakfast table quickly shifted to altering the wedding plans so that it may occur at the soonest date. Lambert's 16th birthday was later this week and he would finally become of the proper age to marry. Though Lind acted as if she was acceptable to those terms, she could not wait for the day until her lover eliminated her fiancé. She prayed to God above that Berengar may strike down Lambert before her child was born. That way, the child would never have to worry about who its real father was. The only person at the table who was not satisfied with this result was Gisela. With this news, the Baroness realized that she would never be rid of her future daughter-in-law. A young woman she greatly despised. Worse yet, Berengar's fling with the harlot had resulted in her having great confusion about the actual parentage of her future grandchild. Much like Adela, Gisela would never have guessed that this was all a ruse by her eldest son to pin the parentage onto Lambert. After all, she was unaware of the war which her two sons waged in the shadows. With this breaking news, the family at the very least pretended to have a pleasant breakfast. Later that day Berengar would finalize another of his schemes to screw over his little brother who had already thrice made an attempt on his life. Berengar was a man who did not easily forgive his enemies, and soon Lambert would come to feel his older brother's wrath.